law that just ignores the rights of students. It also has to hear, I believe, about the experiences in healthcare and scholarship that make important rights issues so central to this debate. I'm submitting testimony from Washington State football player Dallas Hobbs, who outlines some of these issues, particularly as it related to healthcare during the COVID crisis, and also Sedona Prince, an Oregon basketball player who has left with thousands of dollars of medical bills after an injury, and also pointed out the inequities in training facilities during the NCAA tournament. But we're here today to welcome a very distinguished panel, and I want to start by saying, Mr. McNair, I'm so sorry about the loss of your son, Jordan. Thank you. My sympathies are with you and your family. I can't imagine the pain that you must feel from that loss, but I so appreciate you taking the time to advocate for a new law, and thanks to you, Maryland has one, so we certainly appreciate your commitment to this issue. We will also hear from a variety of witnesses who will tell us about the challenges they face in today's world of the NCAA athlete. Kyra Brown, who has underscored the importance of NIL and leveling the playing field for female athletes and how this can help build leadership skills for female athletes. And we're going to hear from Sari Cureton, who also is going to tell us about the athletes and the challenges they face. One of the things clear is that all of you want to provide mentorship, and yet the challenges of providing those mentorships when we have the current rules in place make that very challenging. I also want to welcome Ms. Chenault. Thank you so much for your leadership. I think your testimony more than others really outlines the challenges of NIL. When someone such as yourself can be a voice, attract so much attention, and yet then be limited by how you could use that. We have many challenges to face in getting legislation passed. I think some of the issues that you'll bring up in the hearing today about schools that do have a scholarship certainty, and yet there seems to be still uncertainty to that plight. There still seems to be healthcare, but a lack of mental health in the system. There seems to be changes that we can make that I think would help us move forward on providing student athletes the kind of certainty, not just on their rights, not just on their health care and scholarship, but improve the experience for women in sports today. So thank you all very much for being here, and look forward to hearing your testimony today. I want to thank my colleagues for being here. I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything at this moment or not. Okay, if not, we'll start with you, Ms. Chenault. Thank you so much.
Chairman Cantwell, Ranking Member Whitker, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you all for inviting the opportunity to amplify the voice of the athlete within these conversations by allowing me to testify this morning. This testimony is a direct reflection of my experience and the experience of my former colleagues who are current and former college athletes from across the nation. My name is Christina Chennault. For the past 6 years, I've been a heptathlete on UCLA's track and field team, where I received not only my bachelor's, but a master's degree. During this time, I served as captain, was named second team All-American, and became top 10 in all-time school history. Beyond the track, I created a sports media platform, founded UCLA Sports Business Association, and co-founded the Black Athlete Alliance. From my resume, these years could have been the best years of my life. But instead, they were overshadowed by injustice, trauma, and inequity. This experience is not an outlier, but instead is simply a product of the current system of the NCAA that is riddled with financial, physical, and educational exploitation. Specific to this hearing, I will outline my testimony in order of NIL, health and safety, and educational outcomes. Within NIL, it is important to first recognize that the landscape of collegiate athletics has become completely transformed economically since its origins. College sports has become a multi-billion-dollar business that has a financial monopoly over its commodified athletes. As an athlete entrepreneur, I was not able to monetize my sports media platform. This restriction disproportionately affects low-income, female, and revenue-producing athletes. As a female athlete in the sport of track and field that has no professional American league, my window of opportunity to capitalize off my name, image, and likeness during the peak time of my athletic career was completely stripped away. California is currently granting wide NIL and representation freedoms that I believe all athletes should have access to. In regards to health and safety, some athletes in my program had experienced 5 coaches in 5 years, in which some coaches reduced the scholarship of existing athletes to recruit their own athletes. Unclear contractual regulations enable power dynamics like this that put an athlete's worth on a conveyor belt. Scholarship reductions can be a significant cost that can become unmanageable, especially with limited rights to their name, image, and likeness. Within mental health, I have seen coaches turn down sports psychologists because they were considered out of budget. However, later coaching staffs with the same budget were able to bring in sports psychologists. This issue of mental health should not have been left up to the opinion of coaches. This topic of mental health is very dear to me because in my 4th year, a friend and fellow college athlete at my institution committed suicide. This traumatic experience reinforced that health and safety in college sports is a matter of life and death. I couldn't help but wonder if this could have been avoided if there were more resources, policies, and outlets put in place supporting the psychological health of athletes. Another friend of mine was asked to compete for the greater good of the team before getting an MRI, despite physical symptoms of a re-injured meniscus. It was not until she brought in her parent that she was spoken to and treated appropriately. The MRI diagnosis after the competition revealed a career-ending injury that forced her to medically retire. This experience shows the political posturing institutions and athletic programs will take if health and safety standards are not enforced. The College Athlete Bill of Rights, introduced by Senators Booker and Blumenthal, would enforce these standards. Lastly, when it comes to educational outcomes, there's a substantial educational tracking occurring within the collegiate athletic space. Namely, athletes in college are predominantly housed in 1 to 3 majors at school, which are socially considered athlete majors. Despite the NCAA's claimed educational trade-off, many athletes are limited in their degree choice, which later directly limits these athletes' professional career paths and trajectory. In closing, I share all of this today in hopes that the true athlete voice is heard and regarded for. In a landscape where fear and power discourage the surfacing of athlete stories, I come forth as one with the hope and confidence of 10,000. In all, these institutions should be held accountable, and the college athletes should be protected at greater heights. From the protection of athlete NLI rights, health and safety precautions, and educational outcomes, I believe that change here is necessary and change here is possible. Thank you all for your time and consideration.
Thank you very much for your statement, and we appreciate you being here and for your long advocacy on this issue. Ms. Cureton.
Thank you. It is an honor to speak before you all today. My name is Sari Cureton. I'm a recent graduate from Georgetown University, where I was a walk-on for the Georgetown men's basketball team. Throughout my time at Georgetown, I helped co-found the Black Student Athlete Coalition and worked hard to advocate for student-athlete rights. Throughout my written testimony, I highlighted some key examples of what is wrong with the current collegiate model. When discussing name, image, and likeness, I mentioned how my teammate was unable to use her identity as a student-athlete in affiliation with Georgetown to promote and fundraise for her nonprofit. When talking about health and safety, I discussed problems with misdiagnosis, coaches failing to take action in cases of sexual assault, the need for NCAA assistance for schools that are unable to afford mental health professionals, verbal mistreatment of athletes by coaches, and the dangerous culture of athletics. I also discussed how athlete complaints regarding illnesses and injuries often go ignored. Finally, I discussed problems with inequality with men's and women's sports, but today I would like to revisit these topics and add some additional context to my written statement in the hopes that it will further illuminate the committee's understanding of the student-athlete experience. The story of my teammate starting her own nonprofit illustrates that the current restrictions not only impact athletes in Power 5 conferences who are household names. These regulations impact all athletes. Less than 2% of NCAA athletes go on to play professionally, meaning that the best years for them to monetize their name, image, and likeness is these 4 years at their university. However, my teammate, like many others, we are forced to jump through hoops and told no while our universities and the NCAA uses our name, image, and likeness all to their own benefit. Within this, I think it's also important to discuss the racial component, and that needs to be emphasized. In D1 sports, football and men's basketball are the highest revenue-generating sports. A majority of these athletes are Black. However, a majority of the individuals that are making money off of this industry that are created off the backs of these athletes are white. These athletes have limited resources in their ability to advocate for themselves. Therefore, I would encourage the committee to once more look at this issue as a civil rights matter. Although name, image, and likeness is a pressing matter, the issues relating to health and safety still deserve ample attention, because if not for the physical sacrifices of student athletes, this industry would not exist. Beyond the factors previously discussed in my written testimony, the issue of financial responsibility is another one that needs to be examined. The NCAA currently does not require its member schools to offer insurance. Most do offer some sort of support, but most is not all. The level of assistance can vary from school to school due to a lack of uniform regulation. In my personal experience, the university helped with my hip surgery, but when it came to prescriptions, I had to provide for the copay. At other universities, student athletes have to pay for a second opinion. When you first read that, that may not sound like a big deal, but when you can't trust the opinions of the medical advisors at your university, having to seek out additional medical advice and pay for it becomes a huge matter. Even in a situation like mine, where I had medical assistance from my university, the process of sending documentation to trainers and making sure that the right insurance is paying for the right thing is complicated and inefficient. And if athletes do not have the support of family, it is very difficult to navigate that process. Even now, there's still the question of who pays for your injury after you graduate. Once your eligibility is exhausted, the responsibility of the school is done. And because scholarships are year to year, it is possible that a school may terminate its relationship with an athlete and a student is left with medical bills as well as tuition. Generally speaking, through all the toll of playing at high-level athletics, a lot of times your injuries outlast your 4 years of eligibility. I personally am still dealing with my injury, and I've heard stories of athletes who know for certain that once they graduate, they will need surgery in order to continue on living a fulfilling life. The women's basketball tournament, as well as the Women's College World Series. It was illustrated that these inequalities also impact matters of health and safety, with the differences in testing, PCR versus antigen testing at the women's basketball tournament, as well as the scheduling of doubleheaders in the Women's College World Series. Women are continually asked to perform at a high level while being given less resources at every stage of their athletic development. It is high time that women are treated with the same respect as their male counterparts. In conclusion, not only do these changes need to be made to better protect athletes, but there must be action taken to ensure that athletes are educated on their rights. I encourage you all to reflect on the fact that I've only scratched the surface of the issues that student athletes face. We haven't even discussed the matters of the rights of LGBTQIA members within the athletic field, or even gone further into the racial disparities that exist. I'm here today representing the stories of not only myself, but many other athletes that are too afraid to speak up because they are worried of what it will mean to their future. I, like my peers, am appreciative of the opportunities that have been afforded to me through sports. But that does not mean the system is perfect. Student athletes deserve better. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cureton. Thank you so much for being here and for that testimony. Mr. McNair. Thank you.
Martin McNair, father of Jordan McNair, founder of Jordan McNair Foundation. Today I'm speaking in support of the Name, Image, and Likeness Bill with a notable provision that a baseline standard be set for all student athletes to have the same level of health and safety protection guidelines in place across the nation. The Jordan McNair Safe and Fair Play Act passed unanimously through the House and the Senate this year in the state of Maryland. The bipartisan sponsorship of Delegate Lehrman, a Democrat, and Senator Justin Reedy, a Republican, agreed on a notable provision that the health, wellness, and as well as the safety of our collegiate student athletes is more of a priority than paying them for the name, image, and likeness. May 27, 2018 was the last time I had a conversation with my son, Jordan Martin McNair. He was excited about football conditioning practice starting the next day, as any 19-year-old would be, with aspirations of making it to the NFL one day. Less than 24 hours later, I was telling Jordan, son, if you can hear me, squeeze my finger. Son, if you can hear me, blink your eyes. Within 72 hours, the doctors at the University of Maryland Hospital Shock Trauma Unit told Jordan's mom, Tanya, and I that 85% of Jordan's liver had necrosis, and if we didn't agree to an emergency liver transplant, he'd be dead within 12 hours. Last Sunday, June the 13th, we celebrated or honored the 3rd year of Jordan's death as my family visited the cemetery from a 100% preventable heat stroke suffered that day of conditioning practice. I relived these last few weeks of my son fighting for his life from May 28th to June the 13th for the last 3 years. I can't get out of my mind the athletic trainer on the field that day yelling, if he can't walk, drag his ass across the field. As my son's core body temperature was above 104 degrees, he was in a full heat stroke. 1 hour and 46 minutes passed before my son finally made it to the hospital emergency room that day. No parent in America sends their student athlete away to college for them to be abused mentally, physically, or in our case, worse. Especially when it's at the hands of the coaching staff we entrust our most precious gifts with. We don't, but it happens all too often in college sports. It needs to stop, and the systems need to be put in place at this level of legislation. The safety, protection, and wellness of all collegiate student athletes should be a paramount priority before we consider paying them for their name, image, and likeness. How can we support a student athlete getting paid when we can't keep them safe? The College Athletes Bill of Rights, introduced by Senators Booker and Blumenthal, would enforce these health and safety standards of our student athletes. Let's follow the bipartisan lead of the legislators in Maryland, not only to create an opportunity of economic freedom, but again, create a baseline standard of health, safety, as well as the protection for all of our student athletes. Student athlete safety is something we can all relate to. There are no cultural, financial, or political differences among us. Just think, Jordan could have been anyone in this room's son, brother, or family member. It's everyone in this room's responsibility to keep them all safe. Thank you for allowing me to speak, and God bless us all.
Thank you, Mr. McNair. Thank you. Ms. Brown, welcome. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you. Chairwoman Cantwell, Ranking Member Wicker, and distinguished members of the United States Senate Committee, thank you for inviting me to share my experiences as a student athlete today. It's a great honor and privilege to be here. My name is Kyra Brown, and I'm a rising junior and track and field athlete at Vanderbilt University. Today, I want to share my experiences with the NCAA guidelines, gender equity in college athletics, and how my thoughts on NIL legislation could alleviate difficulties on both fronts. Part of maintaining my eligibility means that I cannot receive what the NCAA terms extra benefits, which refers to anything that's not available to the general Vanderbilt student body. It has also been explained as not being able to receive anything special because I'm an athlete. And while I understand the spirit of the rule intends to prevent boosters from giving me special gifts, it becomes a constant worry that I may unintentionally endanger my athletic eligibility. Recently, I completed the House ethics training to be an intern here on the Hill, and a lot of what I learned in that training echoes what I've been taught about eligibility, but I just don't think being a student athlete should be held to the same level of stress and difficulty as working on the Hill. For example, another one of my teammates' dads once offered to buy us ice cream after a particularly successful meet. And one of our coaches was jokingly like, oh, well, I didn't hear that. And while it's not an extra benefit, there is an exception for family members and sort of people you already know giving you gifts. The environment around these eligibility rights is very confusing and sometimes difficult to understand. And the inclination is always to not do the thing or accept the gift just out of fear, when rather we should be focused on playing our sports and sort of enjoying these 4 years rather than always tiptoeing and trying to ensure that we don't somehow get in trouble. The rule functions more as a headache than the protective barrier that it was meant to provide. Even in the age of Title IX, men's and women's sports are sometimes also not treated equally in college sports. Some of this disparity is systemic, like we've seen at the NCAA in women's basketball and softball, but other issues are simply interpersonal. For example, there was an issue a few years ago when only the football team was having breakfast in our athlete dining hall, which I'm going to be honest, is the best food on campus. But after some requests were made by the women's soccer team, who also had morning practice, now all athletes are allowed to eat in the dining hall, sort of all 3 meals of the day. I don't believe this anecdote reflects a malicious or sexist intent on part of the dining hall or the athletics staff. I think rather it speaks to the fact that while our men's team's needs are often top of mind, sometimes women's accommodations can be an afterthought, and that shouldn't be. One justification provided for some gender disparities in treatment, especially on the NCAA level, is that men's sports make more money. I think that NIL legislation could be a key element in changing that as well. It's well known that the NCAA also does more to promote their men's sports than their women's sports. We don't even call the women's basketball tournament March Madness. I think that if female athletes were able to partner with companies or in other ways promote their own athletic endeavors, that might be a way to supplement the advertising that the NCAA neglects to provide and bring more viewers to women's sports. Passing NIL legislation would also likely free student athletes from any of their fears surrounding extra benefits and eligibility. For example, the way the rules are currently structured, I cannot be able to advertise as a track coach saying that I'm a Vanderbilt track athlete, even though that's pretty much what makes me qualified to coach the sport. That would be considered being paid for your athletic ability or reputation. Especially in sports that don't get as much publicity, this is a great way for students to earn some extra money, but it's currently prohibited. By freeing student athletes from their fears and concerns around extra benefits and rules like that, NIL legislation also has the opportunity to help student athletes become entrepreneurs and create their own opportunities in an arena they already know well, their sports. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Well, again, thank all of you for being here, and you each hit on very unique aspects of this challenge. I think I want to start with you, Mr. McNair. How do you think you were successful in getting this legislation through in Maryland, focusing on the issue of health care? And how do you think, given the new law that is in place there, what should we do here to make sure that these standards are met across the country?
Well, one of the things that, Ms. Cantwell, one of the things that I think the reason we had success with in Maryland was one of the, last year we didn't make it out of the House, so that was one challenge. There was a lot of ambiguity there. However, one of the things that we did this year was, as far as we wanted a bill that would align with our foundation's missions. So our foundation's mission is the promotion of awareness, education, and the prevention around heat-related injuries. So we stuck to our guns in regards to the player safety and wellness component of it. And one of the things I was very, very adamant about, I didn't want to use my son's name from a notoriety perspective. So if it was just going to be name, image, and likeness, that was something that we really didn't want to focus on, because we knew how paramount that the actual safety of a student athlete was first. You can pretty much hear, as my panel members up here state, that the challenges that they've had. I'm speaking as a parent for their safety if the shoe was on the other foot, in a sense. So I think one of the things is we just have to really stay adamant and focus about player safety. What I think at this level, as opposed to us being in individual states, we have to create legislation, or you all have to create legislation from a perspective where it's one system that kind of governs all of it, because we need a baseline protection system across the board for student athletes at all levels of college education or college competition.
I think Mr. Gilmore, Mr. Gilmore, when he was here, mentioned, that the fact that the statistics showed that there were 30 deaths, I think, over the last decade plus in this area in NCAA, while there was only one death at the NFL level.
Correct.
What is it that you think needs to happen to make sure that institutions across the country are adhering to a standard and enforcing it?
Okay, so in regards to the NFL, that was Corey Stringer, to be specific. And the NFL has the resources to put the right systems in place financially, the same systems that all colleges have, in a sense. So I think that one of the main things is we can't do a one-size-fits-all, and I think we can't do a one-size-fits-all approach to this, in a sense. And I just really think that to really keep student-athletes safe, we have to put the systems in place, and I don't want to sound redundant, but again, that's what I really mean. We have to put the baseline systems in place. The NCAA has to put the baseline systems in place, or the states that have this bill. But again, we don't want to have 52 different states that protect student athletes. I think that what I would suggest is follow Maryland's lead and put this as a priority. We're not interested in name, image, and likeness, and you can wear the type of sneakers you want. We need to keep young people safe because, again, when you have young people, and I'm to speak for, I'm sure all of these, my panel members will agree with me, whenever you have any type of college sports or sports overall, it's not an issue of what's going to happen, it's a matter of when it's going to happen. And something is always going to happen, and we have to put the right systems in place that we're always prepared.
Ms. Chenault, the Pac-12 is usually seen as a leader on these issues, and yet you're citing still gaps in the system, particularly about second opinions and mental health. What is it that we need to do? And also on the scholarship side, it seems like they have the best scholarships, and yet you're telling me that the system still can be undermined.
Yes, thank you, Senator. I think there definitely needs to be a national bill put in place. I think the autonomy can't be put in place just for the institutions to take up individually. When that happens, especially in a system where athletes do not have the power within the system, the athletes are always going to be put on the back burner or put at a state of disadvantage. So I think there should be a widespread bill that, like Mr. McNair stated, from a health and safety standpoint, can take the precedent of Maryland. From an NIL standpoint, I think it can take the precedent of California's SB 206. And I think just for equality across the nation and fairness, it should be implemented at a nationwide standpoint. So that is definitely something that I think is an opportunity for change here and correction in the future.
And I wanted to ask, in those instances that you were referring to, both in your own situation or the case with the meniscus, do you think that people knew who to go to talk to at the university besides the coaching team? Did you think of anybody that you could go to and approach at the university?
I don't think athletes really trust that many professionals at the institution. I think there's a big fear from athletes that it will all come back to their coaches or in some way have a financial implication on their end regarding their scholarship or playing time or whatever the case may be that will limit their ability to play or do what they love to do. So I think athletes don't know who else to go to. They aren't referenced anybody else outside or externally that they can go to as well for medical help and assistance. So I think that aspect is really limiting, and I think there should be availability for like a third party or a second opinion that isn't currently there.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Moran.
Chairwoman, thank you very much. Thank you for the panel for being here. I recognize that it's probably a circumstance in which others have a stronger voice in the topic that we're about, and I'm pleased to have students and their parents here today, student athletes, to give us their perspective. I was started down a different path, but then Senator Blumenthal walked in, and it caused me to turn to you, Ms. Cureton. I'm troubled by your testimony. Senator Blumenthal and I chaired and ranking members of a subcommittee in the past that dealt with sexual assault and abuse with the United States Olympics. And you mention in your testimony, you describe a failure to act in cases of sexual assault, and that you've had conversations about specific cases that were reported, but no action was taken. And then Ms. Chenault, in response to the chairwoman's question, was talking about answering the question about who do you go to and lack of trust. I mean, what strikes me here is that what we heard from U.S. Olympians was very similar to what you're describing today. One, we don't know who to report to, we don't trust anybody. We have each other, is what appeared to me with U.S. athletes, Olympic athletes. Seemingly that would be true for you, but beyond that, there's no one to talk to. And then secondly, sexual assault is or can occur and isn't being reported, and if reported, nothing is being done. I just would, any or all of you, but Ms. Cureton, maybe we'll start with you. Is there something that it would be helpful for me and the committee to know about that circumstance. When what I saw at Michigan State and others in regard to the Olympics is shocking to me. I thought it's terrible to have one victim. What I could never understand was why there was more than one. Where are the adults, if that's the right word, who respond to this circumstance? And if that's something that we ought to know about, I'd like to know about it.
Yeah, thank you. I think that a bigger part of the problem is that we're underestimating the interests of these coaches in winning games, and we're underestimating the interests of the athletic department in protecting their image publicly. Athletes are told to report things, like she already mentioned, in-house, but when it comes down to that, there's still the interest that wins out of winning games, keeping your job, maintaining the image of the organization that is put over the interest of student-athlete health and well-being. On top of that, like has already been discussed, oftentimes we don't know who to report to, or we report it to an individual and then we're told it's being handled, and then come to find out later on it never got to the Title IX coordinator, or we don't even know who our Title IX coordinator is. So I think there's a lot of gaps in the system in that sense, and I think the experience with the U.S. Olympic team mirrors that of a lot of student athletes, of just feeling uncertain of who to talk to, who you can trust. It may even come down to being with teammates. You don't know if you can trust them either, if they're after your spot, and who you can have a conversation with. In the instances and discussions that I had, it was a case of assault between teammates, so the coach was even less likely probably to act in that scenario. In other instances where it may be an act committed by an athlete in the community, there's little conversation about how that's being handled properly. So like I said, once again, I think it's a lack of athletes being made aware of what their rights are and who to go to. And I think at times that can be a gap, but I think sometimes that's intentional too.
If you experienced or witnessed or were told about a sexual assault, would you have been told, or are there a policy in place as to who it should be reported to?
Yes, there is a policy in place. In my experience, though, a lot of student athletes go to whoever they feel most comfortable with in the department first, but sometimes that doesn't necessarily work to their advantage. Just like I said before, the interests of the organization are oftentimes at stake.
Senator Blumenthal, and he may agree with me in this, it's very similar to what we heard in our investigation of the Olympic circumstance. Does anybody else have any comments that I should hear about this, Mr. McNair?
So one of the main things, Senator Moran, Senator Blumenthal as well, as a parent, let's not forget these are still children. And these are still kids. So again, no matter how tall they are, at the end of the day, my son was 6'5", 300 pounds, and he wore a size 16 shoe, but he was still 19. So again, one of the things in Maryland that we enact, a bill was passed last year, I believe in 2019, and it's called the Jordan McNair Act. And what that does is, because of our situation or our scenario at the University of Maryland at that particular time, you have a hotline that student athletes can call, and they can call without fear of retribution in the fact of a situation like this. So maybe that should be something that we should implement in this level of legislation, that you can, you can call if you feel uncomfortable or something that may happen that you don't know who to report to. But again, you can call this number without fear of retribution, without a coach telling you, don't bite the hand that feeds you, and all of the mind games that the coaching staff plays on our student athletes. But at the end of the day, let's not forget these are young people, and a lot of times when these things happen to them, this is basically, unfortunately, a lot of times their first real reality that life just isn't, the world isn't a pretty place. And a lot of times when this initially happens, who do they report this to? So they usually turn on each other. And as parents, I think we take the onus as well, because we'll ask. I never thought to ask Jordan about this thing in particular. You ask questions, how was school or how was practice? You'll get a one-line answer. So if you're not asking a definitive questioning by saying, do you feel uncomfortable? Is somebody making you feel uncomfortable? Is it something that is going on that you feel uncomfortable about that you should share? So if we're not asking these questions, we'll get this type of result.
Thank you for the reminder of the value of parenting.
Yep, thank you.
Chairwoman, thank you.
I want to thank you, Senator Moran and Senator Blumenthal, for your work on the Olympic bill. And Ms. Cureton, I just want you to know it's intolerable that there could be evidence of a sexual assault and it was not responded to by institutions. We are not going to tolerate that, and I will work with my colleagues here in our oversight role on these institutions to make sure that all incidents are reported and dealt with, and communication about how they're being dealt with is there. Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for having this hearing. I think it is typical of your leadership, Senator Cantwell, that you are asking the people most directly affected, the lives who are impacted, to talk to us about what this issue means. And I want to thank my colleague, Senator Moran, for being here today and for his partnership on this issue. And Ms. McNair, I want to thank you particularly for being here. I should mention the Jordan McNair Safe and Fair Play Act, passed by Maryland, was bipartisan. This cause should be bipartisan. We should all feel the grief and the anger that brings you here today. I have 4 children. They've all played sports. With every one of them, in the countless hours I've spent watching, there are moments when I hold my breath when something happens to them, as every one of your parents and your friends and loved ones have as well. And today, every one of your eloquence should motivate our colleagues to be here in spirit. And to Mark Emmert, you should be listening. You should be listening with your heart. To the coaches and college administrators and college presidents, you should be listening to these voices and seeing these faces, because they speak for America. The colleges are in a race with each other to recruit. And they're now coming to the table because they face a patchwork of state laws that is desperately inconvenient for them in a monetary sense. But your testimony shows that athletes want more than just to be shown the money. It's about futures and careers and basic health and safety standards. Ms. Chenault, I couldn't say it better than your testimony when you say, after the grief of losing a friend to suicide, this is when I realized that these issues around athlete health were not tenuous ones, but matters of life and death. More than just NIL standards. We need basic health and safety standards. We need guarantees of educational opportunity so that athletes will be more than just a slab of meat. As my colleague, Senator Booker, has said, the billions of dollars that colleges make from college sports are the result of the blood, sweat, and tears of athletes like yourselves. So my hope is that we'll do more than just NIL, that we will have health and safety standards, that we will have a medical trust fund, that we will have guaranteed educational opportunities so that the scholarships last beyond just the 4 years that people may spend in school, and so that your son, Mr. McNair, will be remembered for the courage that he showed on the field, but also your courage in making his memory count here. Let me ask each of you, is the current NCAA system working? Isn't a critical part of what's needed here enforcement? In other words, accountability. The standards for education, for healthcare, need to be enforced. Would you support the College Athlete Bill of Rights, with those standards and with enforcement mechanisms. I'll ask each of you to respond.
Yeah, I can go first. Thank you, Senator. I definitely would support the College Athlete Bill of Rights. I think the NCAA right now, the system is working for how it is currently built, which is on injustice and inequity and exploitation, which is why I think it is of paramount importance to be able to enact this Bill of Rights for college athletes across the nation. I definitely think the biggest issue is the lack of accountability. Once it is left to just institutions specifically, that is, I think, the biggest issue. So I would 100% support the Bill of Rights for college athletes, and I think it's not just a want for athletes. I definitely think this is a bipartisan act, and I think it's a need for all athletes in the future.
Ms. Cureton?
Yes, thank you, Senator. I completely agree. I think that the system, it's intentional that a lot of the decisions are being left to institutions because it takes the responsibility off of the NCAA. And it makes it more difficult for enforcement measures. I think it's obvious that the NCAA is more concerned with enforcing matters of athletes monetizing their NIL as opposed to these issues that we're discussing of healthcare and health and safety. So yes, I would 100% support the Student-Athlete Bill of Rights.
Senator Blumenthal, of course I do. I'll say one thing. When Jordan passed, the NCAA insurance policy for all the student athletes is $10,000. The life of a student athlete of an organization that makes hundreds of billion or industry is only worth $10,000. Of course, I support the bill. It's needed.
Thank you.
Yes, I also support the Student-Athlete Bill of Rights. I have had a fantastic experience at Vanderbilt thus far, but I don't think that's because of the NCAA. I think that's because of Vanderbilt. And I think everyone deserves the sort of safety and joy that I've found playing college sports, and clearly, as we've spoken about today, that's not true for everyone, and it should be. Thank you.
Thank you. My time has expired. I have more questions. If we have an opportunity to ask them, I will. But again, I just want to express my profound thanks to each of you for being here today. And I might just say in closing, Ms. McNair, there's a saying that we die twice. The first is when we take our last breath. The second is when we are forgotten. Jordan will not be forgotten. He is part of what we need to keep in mind here. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Klobuchar.
Oh, thank you very much, Chair Cantwell, and thank you for holding this important hearing, second hearing, which was hearing these witnesses, I think, was really necessary. I'll start where Senator Blumenthal ended with you, Mr. McNair, and I want to extend my condolences on the loss of your son, and thank you. It takes a lot of courage to share your views after what happened. And I know you just talked about the help that would come from a bill like this, but could you talk about some of the additional types of the support that should be in place to ensure the well-being of students?
Yes, I believe that the question, in regards to your question, Senator, so the extra things and even in regards to when Senator Booker and Senator Blumenthal talk about the type of injuries, when you look at heat stroke, you look at brain injury, and you look at various other injuries that student athletes will unfortunately, may come across in a sense. These are things that realistically, these things need to be diagnosed as Ms. Chenault just said. These are bills that, or things that added to the bill that should be acknowledged to the point because so many players and so many programs at college, athletic trainers may be telling people to come back or student athletes to return to play long before they're ready to return to play. I remember when Coach Mike Loxley took over again as University of Maryland head coach, and he called me, he asked me, he said basically, what do you want me to do? And the first thing that I asked him to do, I said, Coach, you got to get a team doctor just for the team. And secondly, you have to get a mental health professional just for the team. And those are things that you cannot take lightly, and those are things that are paramount, because young people, at the end of the day, I'm speaking as a parent right now, young people are young people regardless of their size and their athletic ability. These are young people, and they're just probably at the second leg or the second journey of their life where they still need parental supervision or parental guidance or the guidance of people that have their best interests at heart. So those are the things that should be added and not be taken lightly.
Exactly. Well, thank you. And Ms. Cureton, just following up on the words of Mr. McNair there, in your testimony, you highlighted the need to educate coaches on the health needs of student athletes, including the mental health needs. What do you think needs to be done to help support the mental health of student athletes?
Thank you, Senator. As Mr. McNair already mentioned, the need to have mental health professionals on site is incredibly important. We have one in-house at Georgetown, but she is one person and still unable to meet the needs of the over 700 student athletes. As far as coaches are concerned, I believe there's a dangerous culture in athletics that a lot of times motivates athletes to, one, push through injuries, but two, accept mistreatment because they believe it's just part of the culture. I mentioned in my testimony that I've heard coaches make comments like the only reason you're at Georgetown is because we gave you this scholarship, which is particularly demoralizing to a group of predominantly Black female athletes in a predominantly white space. There have also been comments made about weight without any consideration for how that may affect an individual's mental health. So when I talk about educating coaches, I'm going above and beyond and having these conversations about how the words that they say and the actions they take can impact student athletes. The examples that I mentioned, some coaches may look at that and be like, oh, that's really not that big of a deal, and may struggle to see the fault in it. And that's just the baseline. It goes all the way up to what we would probably consider abuse in the student athlete community that athletes endure under this idea that it's just a part of playing a sport.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ms. Brown, in your testimony, you highlighted the disparities and something Senator Cantwell mentioned between male and female athletes with respect to access to facilities and healthcare. In your view, how would allowing student athletes to profit from their name, image, and likeness help close that gender pay gap?
I think part of what the issue in gender is just that because right now, as we spoke about earlier, men's football and basketball are sort of the banner sports. That's where your attention is drawn. I'm sure you'll get asked more questions about them. They're, at least football is sort of like the biggest team, I think, on our campus. And by allowing student athletes the opportunity to better sort of explore their own avenues of revenue or other items outside of the college, like individual setting, you're empowering them. So even if it's not necessarily that, I don't know, Vanderbilt is going to give me more money or something like that, if I can go outside to say, I don't know, Nike or Athleta and ask and know from there that I am valued, I can bring that sense of value back to my school if for some reason my school isn't providing it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Kind of like there's a lot of women consumers out there that might be interested in you and your image outside of who plays on the male football teams is, I think, one way to think about it. So, and that could then help your get more interest in women's sports, since that's used as the argument. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Senator Cantwell.
Thank you. Senator Tester.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank everybody for being here today. Very much appreciate it. I'm just curious. This isn't in my questions. I'm just curious. Ms. Chenault, what athletic sport did you excel in?
Track and field.
Track and field, hurdler?
Heptathlete, so a little bit of everything.
Sounds tough. Ms. Brown?
Track and field, I'm a 400-meter sprinter.
Okay, and Ms. Cureton?
Women's basketball.
Cool. Well, I want to thank you all for being here. I could pick any one of you to ask my first set of questions to, but I'll ask Ms. Chenault. In the testimony, you talked about not getting, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but not getting an equivalent education as other people who weren't student athletes. Can you explain why that is? Is that because practice time was so intense and it's much longer than the 20 hours that, I think it's 20 hours that they're required? Or is it because trips were scheduled with no sort of respect for the academic achievement? Or is it something else?
Thank you, Senator. I think it's a combination of actually what you just spoke about. First is the fault line of college athletes being told that there's only 20-hour-of-a-week practice schedules. I think all athletes know that's not true. We definitely exude way more than 20 hours a week of just athletically related and dedicated time. I know the Pac-12 did a study recently of the past couple of years that proved that it was closer to 40 to 50 hours of athletically related time. Whether that
So
be
can I ask you, are the administrators or anybody paying attention to how much practice time is actually occurring? Because it's no secret, it is no secret that you guys spend a lot of time in your sport.
Yeah, I think it's because the policy right now shows that it's just 20 hours maybe on the track or the field or the court. So that doesn't include necessarily all the time watching film or all the time where you are doing rehab or ice bathing or doing whatever you have to do to prepare fully. So there is a loophole kind of within that system that I think all colleges do take advantage of, since it is a race to produce the highest athlete at a win at all costs culture.
And isn't there also a unspoken, maybe it's not even unspoken, maybe it's spoken, that if you're not willing to put in the extra time, you might not be on the team?
Yeah, I think a lot of colleges use the trust the process to get buy-in from a lot of their athletes. And from an athlete standpoint, I don't think they realize right away, or a lot of athletes, we don't realize right away that this is a form of educational exploitation. We buy into that culture, and then it's not until they are faced with the career realities of having to completely start over, especially if you do not go professional as an athlete, that you were not put in the best position to be able to excel.
Were you a full-time student as well as a scholarship athlete?
Yes, I was.
What percentage of classes do you think you missed because of the fact that you were a scholarship athlete?
Probably in winter quarter, since UCLA is built on quarters. We traveled Thursday through Sunday. So when I say we aren't allowed to, or we're educationally tracked, I can't take a major, or I can't be in a major that requires my attendance on Thursday or Friday, which is 2 out of the 5 days, and a lot of
40%.
classes being Tuesday, Thursday, or Wednesday, Friday. So it narrows down a lot of opportunities, maybe 10, 20% of classes.
Okay, I appreciate that information. Mr. McNair, my sincere condolences to your family. I remember when your son passed. I remember seeing that. I'm in Montana, and I remember seeing that story about a Maryland football player. And I can tell you that health and safety and humidity and heat are not something. Humidity and heat's not something I deal with. I'm way too Nordic for that stuff. Okay, and so when you have a student athlete that's out there on the field that's under distress, as your son absolutely had to be. This didn't happen like that. It happened over a period of time. The question I have is that you were probably in the living room when they recruited your son.
Kitchen table.
Kitchen table.
Yes, sir.
Did they talk about this at all to you, about the safety and health of your son?
No. And the reason that they didn't talk is because as a parent, I didn't ask. So, and that's one of the things I believe I speak for all parents in America, where we don't ask these questions in the event that something happens to my child. What systems do you have? What safety systems do you have in place? I, like the typical parent in America, only ask 2 questions. Can Jordan get some playing time? And I asked another question in regards to mental health and substance abuse support, just because that's my field of business in a sense. But again, I never thought to ask that, because just like I think I speak for all parents in America today, I assume that those systems were in place.
I was just going to say, you didn't have to ask. You should have known. They should have known that this is a high priority. This is, our children are what we live for. And I would just say that in your particular case, being able to set up this foundation in honor of your son is incredibly commendable, and something I think athletes all over the country, and families and parents all over the country very much appreciate. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A lot of the discussion of name, image, and likeness centers on those athletes who already have perhaps the most public recognition. star players of men's college football and basketball teams, and what monetizing NIL might mean for them, their programs, and their institutions. But I'd like to focus on something that has been raised by the testimony of the current and former female student athletes before us today. And by the way, how great it is to have 3 of you here representing the perspectives of college athletes. Really, it's great. Despite the incredible progress we've seen under Title IX, which is nearly 50 years old, women's athletic programs and women athletes still experience second-class status all too often. While I think that there's a lot we can and should do to further the promise of equity under Title IX itself, I'm encouraged by the idea that NIL rights could give women athletes another way to raise their profile and that of their sports, achieve greater parity with male athletes, and advance their athletic careers. So starting with you, Ms. Chenault, given your experience as both a student athlete and with sports media and business development, how do you see the NIL rights issue as a way to advance equity and opportunity for women athletes?
Yes, thank you, Senator. I think, to your point, female athletes definitely can take advantage of NIL if it was enacted. The focus right now definitely is around the revenue-producing male athletes, but especially because there is a disparity between men's and women's sports, I think it would help women's sports even more. For that reason, as a female athlete within the sports media landscape, it was extremely difficult not being able to monetize anything just from a business standpoint. There was no aspect of sustainability. So I think if female athletes were given the opportunity to have the rights to their name, image, and likeness, they would be able to build their platforms more, be able to build businesses. I think they would be able to have creative outlets that aren't just limited strictly to like an athlete mentality, and that's something that can help them long term.
Excellent. I'd love to hear your opinions, Ms. Cureton and Ms. Brown.
Yes, I believe Ms. Chenault has covered that very substantially, but like I mentioned in my testimony, less than 2% of NCAA athletes will have the opportunity to play professionally. And when we look at sports that don't even have a professional level, the best years for athletes to monetize are during those 4 years in college. And like Senator Klobuchar already mentioned, for women's sports, this is a great opportunity to reach into a new market and to be able to brand yourself and to create a financial stability for yourself following your college experience. So this is definitely an opportunity for women to get more exposure. I believe right now women's sports gets about 4% of the media coverage, even though we make up 40% of the actual athletic market. So this is another way that we can get our name out there and better advertise our sport, so that way we can get better facilities, since apparently that's the reason why we're not receiving those.
Thank you. Ms. Brown.
Thank you. Yes, I just think that the NIL legislation would give female student athletes and all student athletes the freedom to better create their own images and actually have control over them. We already have social media, Instagram, TikTok. We're already, even if we have those followings, we're not able to sort of do more with them maybe in the ways that people want to, and I think we should have the freedom to have those opportunities.
Excellent. I'd now like to turn to the topic of meeting the health and safety needs of our student athletes. While I believe we must ensure that every student has access to the health services they need, I recognize that student athletes may have more and different health needs than their colleagues. And Ms. Cureton, you noted in your testimony the importance of addressing both physical and mental health in college athletics. While all college students face some level of anxiety and stress and pressure to perform, I imagine those participating in sports particularly experience those issues differently. Why do you think it's important to focus on meeting the mental health needs of student athletes?
I think it's important for a variety of reasons. I think the athletic environment is not always conducive to a healthy mind, and that makes mental health awareness and understanding that even more important. And I think a lot of times athletes are encouraged to have the mindset to be strong and push through. I know when I first got my injury, I was hesitant to even tell my trainer because I was like, oh, I'm not really playing that much. It must not be that big of a deal. I pulled a muscle. and it turned out that my hip bone had died due to a lack of circulation. So that's the mindset that I'm approaching, my sport with. And imagine what that means for an athlete that's playing 40 minutes every single game and they feel like they're carrying the team on their back. They may not tell you about that injury because of their mental mindset towards it. So it can lead to physical implications. But when we talk about things like anxiety, stress, and depression and all those types of things, the lifestyle that we lead as student athletes means that we put a lot of our identity into being a student, into being an athlete, and we don't take care of that middle portion of ourselves. We'll ignore taking care of ourselves if it means we have to study an extra hour, or if it means we're going to the gym to put up extra shots. So that's why mental health is especially important. And I think during COVID, it was really revealed to me through the experiences of my teammates of just how important that was. They were isolated in an effort to be able to continue their sport. And I think there was definitely a lack of support when it came to handling their mental health and even their physical health needs during that time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. I want to follow up on this since it's come up a couple of times about mental health and second opinions and counseling in general, and obviously the horrific incidents of suicide on campus. So what do you think the structure should be in the context of what do you consider either an ombudsman, a second opinion, or a layer that gives you the discretion that you need to confide in someone either about your physical or mental health? Anybody have any input about that? What you think that structure should look like? Yes, Ms. Chenault.
Yes, thank you. For one, I think mental health shouldn't be reactive. It definitely has to be proactive. So to Mr. McNair's point, I think there should be like a checkup within the athletes that doesn't currently exist, rather than the athlete having to take the autonomy themselves to go search out and find the psychologist. And the second thing is I do think the psychologist should be catered specifically to the athlete, whether it's by sport, whether it's the sports psychologist specifically, or whether it's just the representation of like gender or race as an availability or option for these athletes to be able to go to, so that is not just one person fits all within mental health.
Yes, I definitely agree. I think in our experience, we have one woman on staff and she is a white woman. And in my experience, it was good to have someone there, but it would have been even better if we had a wide variety of options to someone that understands my unique experience as a Black woman and a female athlete. And I think there also needs to be better safeguards in place on educating staff and coaches about the mental health needs of the athletes that they're serving. So it needs to be proactive on every front. So just like you get an annual physical, you should have the opportunity to meet annually and check up with a sports psychologist. I think we're putting our mental health secondary as if it doesn't impact the way that we function in the same way that a sprained ankle would. So I think that needs to be a change and a shift in the perspective and how we look at mental health in athletics.
Yes, so I believe it boils down to the recruiting process. As a young lady just said, I think that when you have coaches, they need to be educated to, even in the recruiting process, it's all about questioning. So as I mentioned earlier, I didn't ask the right questions. And I think that not in fear, but I think that when you have recruiters and coaches recruiting student athletes, they need to ask parents like, hey, does your child have any mental health issues? Because a lot of times, usually what happens, it never comes up until it surfaces once your student athlete gets to college, where in reality, I think as a parent, a lot of times they may not want to blow the opportunity of their child, whether they're saying, hey, I know they may be experimenting with substances or whatever the case may be, or they may have a mental health challenge beyond what they're taking medication-wise. And I just think that it needs to be full transparency all across the board in regards to the whole process. That way, a coach or an athletic program knows the person that they're dealing with, as opposed to finding out when it's too late, in a sense, from a reactionary perspective.
Ms. Brown?
I think they all covered it pretty well. I might add maybe having access, or at least having the trust or faith that there's a wall between sort of whoever works with students on their mental health and sort of the coaching staff. I think sometimes there's a fear of like, what you say there, even though you know it's confidential, somehow leaking out, or someone even finding out you're seeing one if that becomes an issue on your team. So just making sure the trust and like sort of the feeling of safety is there for the athletes, so they know this is someone they can go to and it won't affect how they're treated on their team or something like that.
So that's really what I was getting at, so thank you for bringing that up. I think both on the healthcare side, broadly on healthcare, physical and mental, what do we So we've had a lot of discussion with a lot of athletes about this, and one of the things we've talked about is the second opinion from somebody at the university, and some athletes have said, well, that might not even be, enough distance, depending on whether you trust that individual not to go back, or, the implications of the university caring. So can this be somebody at the university, or it has to be outside the university?
Personally, I think it has to be someone outside of the university. Yeah, because when we look at the power dynamics of a university, even from the individual athlete level, then you have a coach, then you have the AD, then you still have like the chancellor of the school. So even for a lot of these issues that we've talked about, if the athlete brought it up to the coach, and if the coach actually agreed and brought it up to the AD, and there's still a limitation, I think, from the top down of protecting the image. So I do think of the institution as a whole. So I do think it would have to be outside.
Okay, anybody else on that point?
Yeah, I think the key point is just making sure that they're accessible to athletes. So that's kind of what I worried about. I think before we had a sports psychologist, our model was that they could refer you to an outside individual, but you had to ask for that. So sometimes I think that having someone that's there and present within your community might be easier as far as accessibility is concerned, but maybe having them be accountable to someone else, like they're not accountable to your athletic director. When it comes to talking about different things might be the route to go, but I do agree that the power dynamics are something that are worth considering, but I think accessibility also needs to be prioritized.
So clear independence.
Yes.
So an ombudsman of sort could work, or, someone at the institution who is seen to have that unique role not reporting into that system.
Yes.
Okay, Mr. McNair?
Yeah, I agree with both what they both said. I think that you definitely need to have an ombudsman or outside system, outside health system that tends to these matters especially with these type of things. Because as the young lady just said, it's that tier system. And I know I can speak for, I can't speak for, but I know one word, one phrase a lot of athletic directors don't really want to hear is lack of institutional control. And it's kind of like, how did you miss that? And again, that makes the image of the organization or the school look bad.
Thank you. Thank you. And Ms. Brown, do you have anything else to add to that? You kind of started us off, so we're good. Okay, Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks so much. Let me follow that line of questioning, if I may. I think what we're talking about here is accountability. And the College Athlete Bill of Rights provides for a commission, independent of the NCAA, independent of the colleges, to investigate and take action to penalize and hold accountable colleges. There's a saying, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. What's rhyming here for me is our experience in the Olympic athletes bill, where the colleges and the trainers knew. In fact, Michigan State knew about Larry Nassar's misconduct for 2 decades. And look the other way. That's what we have in a lot of colleges because they are promoting the culture of win at any cost. What they want to do is win. That's how they profit. So more than just athletes sharing in that monetary profit, we need protection for them. Let me quote what Dallas Hobbs wrote to us. Athletes are scared to share what they are going through because they believe they will face repercussions or more harm from those above them. The gymnasts who were victims of Larry Nassar were petrified to report the abuse because they feared they wouldn't be allowed to compete. They would be cut. They would be deprived of the opportunity of a lifetime to be part of Olympic competition. Well, we have exactly the same phenomenon here. Athletes who are victims of cutthroat practices, injurious to them immediately physically, but also, as you point out, Ms. Chenault, the trajectory of their career is hampered because they are forced to major in educational pursuits that are less valuable. In effect, their education and their futures are compromised, and they have no means to complain. So that's why I think this issue of enforcement and standards is tremendously important. And let me ask Mr. McNair about the accountability for the athletic department that were involved in the death of your son. I know this is going to be a little bit more than a little painful for you, but I just want to say the Maryland coach who was fired for creating a toxic environment that was at least partly responsible for the death of your son was fired, but now he's working elsewhere as an assistant coach at another university. And my own feeling is that a coach who's responsible for the death of an athlete, this is the extreme of the phenomenon we're discussing today, should be reported to other institutions and should be held accountable. But more than just that coach, the entire athletic department, as many of you said, the entire chain of command should be held responsible. Would you agree?
Yes.
And the way to do it is through a commission, an independent body. We've talked about an ombudsman, but a commission, in effect, is an ombudsman that can provide for due process and fairness, but at the same time impose accountability. I hope that the athletes who are here today would agree with that idea.
Yes, I do.
Yes, I as well.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you all very, very much. Very meaningful and important testimony today. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to go back over on the issue of NIL rights in general, because I want to get a few things for the record. I know we have a couple of other colleagues who are on their way. One, do you all support getting a federal law in place? Ms. Chenault?
Yes, I do.
Yes, I believe that having a uniform federal law will be beneficial for all student athletes.
Yes, I do as well.
Agreed. I think uniformity is important.
Thank you. And then one of the issues that also often comes up is how you define NIL rights, and not to get into the legal ramifications of fair market value, but there's also issues about making sure that boosters or other people don't artificially influence the value or create a system where somebody's attracting someone to come to a school just, for that specific purpose. Do you have any thoughts on that, Ms. Chenault, or anybody else, on how you see the California law and definition playing out now?
Yeah, thank you. I can go first. I think there should not be too many limitations on NIL, just because if it is left to the institutions, like I've stated, that it won't be implemented equally or fairly across the nation. I think, of course, there are some precautions just to make sure that there is fairness for the athlete too in the institutions. So I think as long as the athletes are kept in mind first, rather than just the institutions or the posturing of the institutions that really might just be trying to take away freedoms from the athlete is kept in mind, then I think the widespread NIL rights that California is implementing will be successful.
So you're aware that then some states are actually within the NIL right limiting the students, and not just if they conflict, but basically giving institutions any ability to say they conflict, which then would thereby be limiting the rights.
Yes, exactly. So that's why I think it should be nationwide of a kind of implementation like California, because I think that posturing that other states are taking, saying that athletes shouldn't be given like full rights to their name, image, and likeness, would have long-term implications that really would just limit NIL's implementation as a whole.
Ms. Cureton?
Yeah, I think that a lot of the problems that we discuss here today, when we talk about pay for play and amateurism, and that's brought up by institutions, I feel like sometimes those words are thrown around, not really in the interest of student athletes as actually protecting and preventing those instances, but more in line with protecting the institution and maintaining their control over NIL rights. So as long as, like Ms. Chenault already mentioned, we put athletes first and we prioritize their right to monetize their NIL, and when we're considering restrictions and things like that, I think that's the most important approach to a national legislation.
And you mean by restrictions, meaning?
When we're talking about preventing, pay for play and things like that, I think that institutions will use that word as kind of like a buzzword, and maybe sometimes it is a real concern, but other times I think it could be more about limiting the rights of student athletes.
Okay.
Yes.
Anybody else on that point? Ms. Brown, anything on that?
I guess one thing I'd add is I think sometimes in discussing like concern over how student athletes are going to manage their money, I think there's an opportunity here to teach student athletes about how to understand the business side of sports, because they already are pretty well versed in how their sport works, and they sort of know, I think, a lot more than people give us credit for about how things work. So I think rather than letting the institution sort of limit how we can use our name, image, and likeness, I think there can be I don't know if this would be a legal thing or just sort of come out later, but we could be allowed to learn, I think, about how NIL would work and be given workshops and that sort of thing, but I don't think we should be limited in terms of how we can use it, maybe just taught or guided as terms of how best it works.
Yeah, Mr. Gilmore brought this point up last week too, about, institutions who basically are gonna say you have to go, you can't have NIL rights if you don't go and take some classes on finance first. And so I think he was very outspoken and pointed on that. Our colleague, Senator Lujan, has arrived. Senator Lujan.
Thank you, Chair Cantwell, and for this important follow-up hearing so we can hear from students and families directly affected by this issue. Mr. McNair, I want to thank you for being here as well and lifting up your son's memory. You're telling stories that people need to hear, and you're helping students along the way, and I want to thank you for that. To the 3 other current athletes and former athletes, but I guess once you're doing this, you're always doing this with your advocacy. I want to thank you and very much appreciate that we also have a D1 track and field athlete here. We sometimes forget those national championships that I know we're all rooting for and watching. We had some athletes from New Mexico recently competing, and I think that we often leave track and field out of these conversations, so it's good to see you all here. On July 1st of this last year, New Mexico will be among the first to allow student athletes to be compensated for the use of their name, image, and likeliness. Back home when we see these incredible athletes and they're on billboards, and then you talk to some of these student athletes and they can't even afford to grab a bite to eat, there's something wrong. And with it, my home state will become a leader on this national issue. Congress must ensure all students across the country have a fair shot. However, we cannot settle for a national solution that falls short or otherwise undermines solutions advanced by states like New Mexico. Our students deserve better, and I'm committed to making sure that happens. Ms. Chenault, at UCLA, you competed in a wide variety of events on the field. What's more, off the field, you've worked diligently to ensure the needs of all athletes and part of the national conversation. You've highlighted the experiences of students who are experiencing mental health problems, racial inequalities, to make sure their voices are heard. This is critical work. I applaud you for it. I believe any legislation we pass here should benefit all students with rights over their name, image, and likeliness, benefit athletes across a wide variety of sports. Do you believe in that, yes or no?
Yes, I do.
What more can Congress do to ensure future legislation helps all student athletes?
I think it's just enacting kind of what you were talking about for New Mexico and also California, what they're doing. It's making sure that it is equal and the language and the legislation is equally treated across all states.
Ms. Cureton, in many of the big ticket sports like basketball, football, minority athletes make up a majority of the players on the field, athletes of color. In your testimony, you highlight the importance of thinking of student athlete rights as a racial justice issue. It's critical to acknowledge this. How have past actions by the NCAA over students' rights to their name, image, and likeliness impact athletes of color?
I think the biggest way is the restrictions that they've placed on them. I think Ms. Chenault also mentioned in her testimony how it disproportionately affects low income and athletes of color and female athletes, these restrictions that are placed on them. But when we talk about like the big ticket sports in general and the revenue that these athletes bring in, I believe it's estimated that March Madness brings in about $1 billion annually off of the TV ads and everything considered. And everyone around those student athletes are normally white. I believe 71% of head coaches in men's basketball in the NCAA at the Division I level are white, while 58% of the athletes are black. So when you're generating that much money and you're not even seeing anything from it as far as the use of your name, image, and likeness is concerned, I believe that negatively impacts you. As you mentioned just previously, there are athletes who have their own struggles as far as income is concerned. Oftentimes, they're at school trying to get this scholarship in the hopes that they'll be able to give back to their families and support their families. So when it's an inability to provide themselves with another income, you're putting them at a disadvantage.
Ms. Chenault, as part of your work off the field, you've worked hard to highlight those challenges that student athletes are facing. In particular, you've done a lot of important work to highlight the mental health challenges athletes all across the country are going through. It's unacceptable that students feel like they can't rely on the very institutions that they're working so hard to represent at a national stage. How should colleges and the NCAA work to better improve student athletes' access to mental health services?
Yeah, I think one of the first things is definitely the educational training of the coaches. One of the things I mentioned in my testimony is that mental health shouldn't be left up to non-mental health professionals or the jurisdiction of non-mental health professionals or the subjectivity, I guess, of non-mental health professionals. So I think that education can help change that culture that doesn't highlight or really isn't very accepting of mental health within the athlete space. So I think that is one. And I think the biggest thing when it comes to mental health for athletes is allowing them to feel safe and allowing them to feel heard. And so whether that be just through the representation of gender and racial mental health professionals that they have access to, or whether that be from third-party mental health professionals that they can trust. So I think either of those implementations would definitely help mental health of athletes from a day-to-day standpoint.
Appreciate that. And Ms. Brown, you bring a powerful testimonial today as well. What have you heard from fellow athletes, whether they're competing with you, alongside you at track and field or in other sports as well, from the institution that you attend?
About what specifically?
Just in general, how they feel, how tough times can be when they're not being allowed to be compensated, when we know how expensive those tickets are when we go watch you all compete. And like I said, they're just struggling, trying to get by. Do you have any of those stories that you've heard that also moved you that you're helping to carry today?
So I know that I'm speaking from a place of privilege where I can sort of afford those flights. My parents are able to do that for me. But I have teammates who sort of don't go home as much as they'd like to, maybe because that's a bigger expense for them. And also, we don't really have time to get jobs, a lot of us. So I just think the NIL legislation is another way that we can sort of monetize what we're already putting much more than 20 hours in a week a lot of times to do. And I think we deserve that opportunity. But yeah, so I don't want to speak too much on that just because it's not my experience. That's what I'd say.
Appreciate that. And Chair Cantwell, if I may ask Mr. McNair one other question as well. Sir, with the work that you've done and the memory, Jordan, with the work the family's doing here, sir, what have you learned with this foundation, and what can we better be doing to make sure that we're respecting athletes and providing them that support that they've earned? I mean, we're going to these games, and I think highly of some of these coaches. I don't agree with all of them. It's easy for me to Monday morning quarterback, if you will, or call from the cheap seats. But I'm there to watch those athletes that inspire me, and you get to know some of them personally. And one of the guys I got to know way back when in New Mexico is a guy named Ruben Douglas. And Ruben, he played around the world. He continues to inspire us, and he's doing great work in the community. But he helped me understand challenges that his fellow athletes were going through as well. What can you share with us today that we can be doing better?
One of the many things that I've learned along the way is, as the young people just said, the three panelists here with me just said, they basically, it's only 2% of student athletes to get to a professional level. So these 4 years are extremely crucial. As the young lady just said, the time involved, or the time that they commit to the school by playing a sport, and obviously it's a reciprocal relationship, a reciprocal deal in regards to the education component of it, but at the end of the day, these are long-term ramifications. The young lady just said she can't really take maybe the major that she wanted to take just due to her commitment to her her athletic commitment. And I just think that what I've learned along the way is the value of student empowerment from a perspective of this is an actual time that you can make something happen. And hey, what if this one of these young ladies wanted to write a book, or they played in a band, or they wanted to do that, and they can't be compensated because of their commitments or whatever the guidelines or the laws that are in place. I just really think that young people's time is precious, and I really think that we need to support them in really maximizing that. And that's just really what I noticed, that, you know, a lot of young people, they'll put that investment in thinking they'll get to the professional level, but it's only 2% for three-point. The average time in the NFL was 3.5, 3.6 years. You spend a lifetime of all that, and when you're done, you're still almost a kid, for lack of a better term. So you still have a lot of life ahead of you. So if we don't put the proper things in place in regards to lifetime scholarships, because some people may leave feeling they have an opportunity. I need to go right now, whether I got my degree or not. So I just think it's more important as a parent or as a committee, as someone said, that we support these young people along the way, and not only support them for right now, but support them for the long term.
And Chair Cantwell, look, well, I never played college sports. I'm a little short. I'm a little wide at the seam. Growing up, I had the honor of competing with some incredible athletes where we found Junior Olympics and car washes and bake sales and whatever we could do to try to earn a buck, mow a lawn. That's what allowed us to go and travel to see these athletes that then we got to watch later run and compete in the Olympics. Jerseys that we would purchase from friends that we watched, they never got $1 from it. And it's just not right. And look, as someone, I think I was the first United States Senator elected that went to Head Start. I thought everyone went to Head Start. I thought that was a program that everyone went for. I didn't know that you had to qualify for that because you didn't earn too much dough. It's an important perspective that we're bringing here. And it's an important story that you all are telling. Let's just do right by the athletes. Let's do right by students and give them a path forward. That's what this is all about. I thank you for your testimony today, and Chair Campbell, I thank you for the time.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Lujan, and thank you for sharing that personal perspective. And I think that is why we're here today, to make sure that we are hearing all perspectives on this issue. So I would be remiss if I didn't ask the women athletes here about Title IX and about tournament and tournament play. One of the testimony that's submitted here today is by Sedona Prince from Oregon, who you may know posted a photograph of facilities during the NCAA tournament. It didn't quite look like the same facilities that the men were participating in. We so appreciate her being outspoken. She's submitted testimony on other issues as well, particularly healthcare. But this brings up an important issue about Title IX and its implementation. What else do we need to do? Do we need to make sure the NCAA complies with it? Do we make sure that tournaments have to comply with it? In your individual athletic experiences, what do we need to do to make the enforcement even across the board? And I think, Ms. Brown, you might have mentioned the name of the NCAA tournament itself being used only in one instance. I'm a firm believer that the age of the internet, that there will be lots of opportunities for people to see content and absorb content. I'm a huge track fan. I actually would love to see more of those events and understand who are the individual athletes in these events. And so what needs to be done here on Title IX as it relates to the competition and making sure there's a level playing field?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I think one point of consideration that is often overlooked is within Title IX, it accounts for football just as a body count, as a head count, to equate equal amount of representation for female sports, but that doesn't equate for like facilities and treatment. So within my experience personally, I know we have our own football facility and then we have our own basketball facility, which because of Title IX, the women's basketball team is able to use that basketball facility. But the entire football facility, which is probably maybe 2-3 times the size as the other facility that the rest of the remainder of all the other sports combined use, is totally different in regards to our training and our treatment. All of our training room for all the other sports outside of football and basketball have to use that amount of limited resources, training, whether that's snacks, We don't have access to meals like the football team does. So there is a little bit of inequity, even though Title IX emphasizes the importance of equity within head count and body count for male and female sports. It doesn't necessarily ensure that the resources and the facilities that we're able to use match or equate to that level of equity.
So doing something besides head count is important.
Definitely.
Yes, Ms. Cureton?
Yes, I think having the NCAA be required to abide by Title IX and making sure the tournaments are also abiding by that policy as well would be extremely beneficial. I think Ms. Prince's testimony, as well as the evidence she submitted during the tournament, is evidence of that, of women being continually treated as an afterthought. But I can say as a female athlete, that wasn't surprising to me. I didn't expect the women's tournament to have the same level of facilities as the men's tournament, and that's sad to say. But we're just aware of that's how we're treated, and that's how the system usually works. So I'm glad that we're able to speak out. In my own personal experience as far as athletics at Georgetown is concerned, like Ms. Chenault already mentioned, I'm a women's basketball player. So when they redid our facility, they had to give us the same court and locker room as the men's team. When it comes to our living situation, initially, until the men moved out of their renovated apartments, we stayed in regular housing like most students do. So a lot of times we get the hand-me-downs from the men's team, and that ends up equating to, oh, well, it's equal. But there's a feeling of that, as appreciative as we are for the resources we had, when you feel like you're an afterthought, it affects you. So, yeah.
I would be curious as where do you think all this can go in the future? I saw this interesting moment that I really didn't understand. Actually, I had a chance to ask the Oregon women's basketball coach about this later, but you know, when they have the NCAA tournament and then they have this shootout event where they basically load up, you know, around the horn of basically how many shots can you get off in a matter of, I don't know what it is. I don't know how many minutes. Anyway, so they have this shootout tournament, and then they pick a winner, and they have a winner of both the men's and the women's division, and then the women and the men face off against each other. The women nailed it. The women beat the men. And asking this coach about this, I guess that's a frequent thing. Well, for me, somebody who was an observer, had no idea that women could outshoot men in that kind of tournament with that level of consistency. I thought that was fabulous. I thought that was like this great moment. And so where do you see, you know, if we could empower more, you know, of women athletes, you know, particularly say in the basketball area, which you're familiar with, where do you see this going? What are the kinds of things that we could do to bring more awareness, bring more revenue, bring more media attention?
Well, I think that women's basketball is an amazing sport to watch, and it's highly competitive. So if we're talking about just media attention and the marketing perspective, there's a lot of untapped potential with our tournament in general. I know just watching it from my perspective, it's fun to watch. And there's a misconception, like you just mentioned, that we can't compete like the men, or it's not as entertaining because we don't do dunks and X, Y, and Z and all that. But that's not accurate to the experience. Most sport fans that really watch women's basketball can tell you it's just as enjoyable as watching a men's game. But on the real world impact as far as girls in sports, I think in my experience, I grew up in a household where basketball was king because my father played professional sports. But male professional athletes respect female professional athletes. You're not going to hear a man in the NBA talk down on a WNBA player because they know what we're capable of. So growing up, I was always shown female sports. So there was never a time in my life where I questioned my capability to play my sport because I was a woman. And I think the more that women and young girls are exposed to that, it can increase the likelihood that we will be a part of sports. And when you think about the impact that sports has on our lives, for all the negative that we've talked about here today, my experience in athletics has helped shape me and make me into the person that is able to sit in front of you, convey these thoughts and opinions, and advocate for what I believe matters. And I think that's a powerful thing. So,
well, I think we've seen in sports overall, the more people know the story of the individuals, it also allows them to, you know, to relate to those players. And I just feel like there's a big anonymous void when it comes to women's basketball, that there's so much there we'd like to know.
yes.
And I mean, obviously Arizona had a great season, had a tremendous player. I'm sure people would want to know more about her. The tournament itself, I feel doesn't get the attention. I feel like we're almost limiting it by the rules that we have in place now. And, some of this may be, on the media as well. I don't know, we'll have to dig in more to that, but clearly, as I said, with the age of the internet, empowering these stories, you have the ability to have so much more consumed and to understand who these athletes are, which are really incredible stories, which then gets to how you empower more women athletes, which is why this is so important to do. Very, very important. Senator Hickenlooper. Oh, Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Chair Cantwell. Appreciate it, and appreciate everybody being here and the great discussions we're already having. But I want to focus a little bit on weather. And I can tell you that if you're looking at the weather this week, not just across the West, but across the United States, we are in record heat temperatures. And so we have to protect our student athletes from the heat. And as some of my colleagues on this committee referenced in our last hearing, since 2000, 32 student athletes have died as a result of heat-related injuries associated with college athletic workouts. I'm especially concerned about the athletes that play outside in arid states like Nevada, where the daily high temperatures hover for months and months around 100 degrees. This week, topping over 115 all week. Like I said, just go to the news and you'll see it all across the country. And so, Mr. McNair, I really appreciate you being here and for your passionate advocacy. And I'm so incredibly sorry for the loss of your son, Jordan. And I hope that his memory is a blessing and inspiration to you and you and your family. You know the dangers of extreme heat, unfortunately, all too well. And can you tell us about the work that you're doing to educate college athletics or athletes, to know about their rights and to know how to listen to their bodies in extreme heat, and our coaches to understand that we may not ever be able to be stronger than the climate. Could you please tell us what you're working on and what lessons Congress can learn to help this problem so it doesn't happen again?
Yeah. Thank you, Senator. Thank you for your condolences as well and wishes of strength. One of the main things that should be known is that, as the Senator just mentioned, this is a prime time for tragedies, especially when it comes down to humidity, heat, student athletes playing outside or competing outside. But one of the main things that I've learned along the way, it's not an issue of students playing out in this type of heat. The main thing is when Jordan went down that day, the thing is you have to let student athletes acclimate. It must be a 2-week process to acclimate. And basically what that means is that you have to let student athletes gradually get acclimatized to the temperatures and the actual weather conditions over a 2-week period before they do any strenuous exertional activities. Now, one of the main things with that as well is a heat stroke isn't a bad thing. People have heat strokes all the time. The main thing with a heat stroke, a mismanaged heat stroke is bad. That's when they become tragic. Student athletes aren't dying in games. Student athletes are dying during conditioning and practice. This time when they're doing too much too quick prior to better hydration, better sleep. Young people are young people. They're going to tell you they're ready when they're not ready. We need to have adults that can be a part of these organizations and look at a young person and say, hey, I can look at you and see that you're not ready. We need to follow up more with hydration, rest, things of that nature. But keep in mind, these tragedies always happen during conditioning drills. They don't happen during games. People don't have heat strokes during games. They happen during conditioning when the conditioning drills aren't properly supervised or the student athlete has not gone through the acclimatization process. And that's key for this type of injury. Heat strokes are 100% preventable. This is the only injury that any medical professional will tell you that's 100% preventable, but you have to put the right things in place in regards to acclimatization before you do anything strenuous. So it may just take a little longer. And again, we lost 20 young people at the AAU and high school level last year in practice, not during games. And this was beyond the college level. So again, young people are still down, but you have to have the right safety equipment in place, cold water tubs, wet bulb globe thermometers, AED machines, things like that have to be in place prior to this acclimatization period or while this acclimatization period is going. So, Senator, that's what I learned to keep our student athletes safe. Those are the things that should be in place.
Well, you're right. It's 100% preventable. And for a person, I have lived in the Southern Nevada, the desert of Southern Nevada for over 40 years. And I know how relentless the heat is. And I'm surely wasn't a student athlete, but being out there too long without the proper prevention, equipment, hydration, I couldn't agree more. We'll see what we can do to help you in this regard, but I hope that all of our coaches and union athletic associations across the country are listening, because this is 100% preventable with the right precautions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Thank you for bringing that unique perspective as a Nevadan to it. Senator Hickenlooper.
Yes, I want to thank all of you. Well, thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this, allowing me to slip in. I want to thank you all for your testimony and for all your work on this issue. Ms. Cureton, and you said you grew up in a basketball-dominated household, so I'm just going to take a wild guess as someone who grew up in Philadelphia that there might have been someone in your house who had the nickname the Twirl, like Earl the Twirl Cureton.
Yes, that would be him.
So one of the really wonderful people in professional basketball, and won a NBA championship. I can't remember, it was either 83 or 84 with the Pistons, and then maybe one later, I can't remember. But he had a heck of a career. And then our hometown hero, Chauncey Billups, almost exactly 20 years after that, won an NBA championship with the Pistons. Anyway, another very classy person. Just thought I'd get that in there. Colorado's one of 18 states to enact a law allowing student athletes to earn compensation from their NIL. Colorado's NIL law passed out of our House, our General Assembly, 55-9, and was approved in our Senate unanimously. So in your view, what policy principles do you think are fundamental for Congress to consider in order to get to a bipartisan NIL law that builds upon the work of states?
Sorry, for me? Okay.
Just because I asked about your dad, you kind of have to answer.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I was like, is it just my dad, or are we gonna have it?
You probably get that all the time.
I do. Yeah, I think a lot of what we discussed here today, as far as we can build upon states, one, California's efforts is something to look at. Two, what we want to avoid is such heavy restrictions that we can't actually, athletes cannot actually monetize their NIL as they would like to. So I think those are two areas to kind of watch out for. And as far as having uniform practices with the NIL, I think it's also important to talk about, the other areas in which student athletes are struggling as far as health and safety concerns. Because I think it's all tied together. I think it's impossible to divorce monetizing your name, image, and likeness from the health and safety concerns, because as I mentioned previously, it is our bodies that have built this industry. So those are the few areas that I would know.
Absolutely. And Ms. Brown, Colorado is a proud home of the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, supports thousands and thousands of talented athletes representing the United States in various sports. In the 2016 Olympic Games in Brazil, nearly 80% of Team USA athletes competed collegiately, representing nearly 150 U.S. colleges and universities. In your view, and others of you can answer this as well, in your view, how can reforming the NIL rights for athletes preserve or even maybe enhance the pipeline for our Olympics competitions?
I think it's part of the issue there is allowing people to sort of take advantage. I think especially in track and field, you see a lot of athletes in college go be Olympians because this is some of the best time, our best athletic time of our lives, and also college sports is for track is one of the best places to get that training. I think sometimes, and so I think student athletes, whether they're in college or I actually. Sydney McLaughlin's from my home state of New Jersey, and she was 16. She was a high school student the first time she raced in the Olympics, and she sort of went to the Olympics and came back because she wanted to go to college, and she wasn't allowed to sort of make any money off of being a literal Olympian because she still wanted to go to college. And I think athletes like her should have the right to sort of monetize their name, image, and likeness at the time at which they're famous and not have to wait until they've done their college time in order to have that opportunity.
Got it. I appreciate that. Does anybody else want to answer? Please.
Yeah, just one thing I wanted to add is I think the implementation of NIL will also just encourage athletes to be able to pursue their education. Similar to the example of Sydney McLaughlin, I know at UCLA we had a lot of gymnasts, they peak or they go to the Olympics at early ages. And because of that, that's a peak opportunity for endorsements at an early age prior to college, which then they're forced to choose between whether they want to take advantage of their name, image, and likeness and be able to monetize and commercialize their name as offers are coming to them, or if they want to pursue an education, which becomes very sticky and difficult of a choice to make at the age of 17. I know the example of like Jordan Weaver from UCLA chose to be able to become a professional and then came out of pocket to be able to pursue her educational pursuit. I don't think that should have to be a choice that the 17-year-old should have to make, and I think the implementation of NIL will alleviate that and allow athletes to move freely and monetize their name while also getting the advantages that college has to offer.
Very insightful. I couldn't agree more. And I have to say I'm staggered, but you are all so thoughtful and athletes. When I was 17, there were no athletes that could express themselves with the same insights, and it's very impressive. It inspires me.
Thank you, Senator Hickenlooper. I have a few more things I want to cover just so we could get them on the record. Mr. McNair, one of the things about the health standards, particularly as we brought up this issue of heat stroke, is who should be responsible for enforcement. In the legislation that you were successful in passing, who is the ultimate enforcer of those standards at the universities in the state of Maryland?
So within the actual state of Maryland, you have at the various universities or the state schools that the law is applicable to. Basically, you have your medical staff there that should cover the oversight of heat-related injuries or who should be trained and things of that nature regarding that. But it always boils down to your athletic training staff, because those are the ones that will be out on the field or out on the field or the course with the actual student athletes. So they have to be trained at the highest level that they can be trained at in regards to education. As I mentioned earlier, heat strokes aren't bad. And even with the University of Maryland at that particular time, they had an emergency action plan that was in place. All of these schools should have an emergency action plan, but it's the equivalent of a fire drill. So this building has a fire drill. However, if nobody does fire, they have a emergency action plan in regards to a fire drill. But if you don't execute a fire drill, how will we know what door to exit out of in the event of a fire? So there was plans in place, but they needed to be practiced and executed consistently. So in the event that something does happen, we'll know what to do. And not only that, but again, student athletes need to know the peak times. They need to know their bodies and things of that nature. I need to know my teammate. If they're out of sorts, in a sense, this could potentially be a heat stroke just due to all of the conditions that may be going on. So the more people that are educated, the better off we'll be. But again, in regards to your initial question, the medical staff and the athletic training staff should be responsible for these.
And so were there penalties, or just the university had to be accountable?
There weren't penalties from the NCAA. However, the university did hold themselves accountable and made all the necessary changes in regards to an independent investigation and the suggestions of the independent investigation. So all of those things are in place now.
And so the primary focus was about education and awareness. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
And then just making sure that that was carried out consistently.
Exactly.
So that, 15 years from now, that this will still be remembered and institutionalized so that people know and understand these conditions.
Correct. So it'll always boil down to awareness, education, and the prevention. And that's what it'll always boil down to that.
And I'm curious, what has been your conversation with the NCAA about helping to make this more standard across the United States?
Non-existent.
Because you've tried, or?
No, just didn't go at them at all or question them at all.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Well, we'll find out where they are in the standard. Another thing I wanted just to clarify, we've been having a lot of discussion about the scholarship length of time past, the 4 years of the institution. I think the Pac-12 is 5 years. It might be longer. What should we be looking at as to guaranteeing the athletic time of scholarships, just so that there's more predictability and certainty, particularly when athletes are injured?
Yeah, I think trying to protect the contracts as much as possible. I think once a coach commits to recruiting an athlete and has them sign something, they should be held accountable. And that means there shouldn't be kind of like loopholes or different ways to get the athlete out of the contract if the coach no longer wants them a part of the team for just subjective reasons or opinions. I think that helps protect the athlete from feeling the pressure to always have to be this commodity, to always have to perform as well. And as we've all discussed, I think throughout this day, there's a lot of pressures from athletes from all different angles. And there's also a lot of circumstances out of your control, whether that be an injury or something else that comes up during those 4 years. So I think putting contracts in place where they cannot be easily revoked in one way, whether it's athletic reasons or whether it's academic reasons, I think that holds the institutions and coaching staffs more accountable to treat the athlete holistically rather than just as someone who can perform.
Ms. Cureton, anything to add there?
Yeah, well, I think when it pertains to injury, I believe it's Gonzaga that has a policy like 2 years after you're injured, the university is still responsible for helping care for you. And I think that extends beyond your eligibility. So I think that injury piece and that responsibility of the university to still take care of you even after you've completed your time and completed your eligibility, even if you're no longer on scholarship, is very important, because now we're looking at injuries that are more long-term when we talk about football and CTE and things like that. And even now coming out of COVID and a pandemic, we don't really know the possible implications for athletes, you know, that had COVID and what that could mean long-term. And so when we're talking about care, I think that it's important that universities take up the responsibilities for athletes that have been negatively affected by, you know, participating in their sport. So it kind of goes beyond scholarship.
Okay. Ms. Brown, anything on that point?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
It's about, well, actually, I was asking about scholarship, but Ms. Cureton added in healthcare, which is great. So it's really about the length of time, you know, so I've talked to various coaches who said things have changed a lot, you know, in the last several years. I'm not sure how much they've changed, so I'm just trying to clarify. And I think Ms. Chenault said it best that, you know, that you can, even at the Pac-12 level, you might have 5 or 6 years to complete your scholarship. If you were injured, you had that extra time to complete your education. But then if there's a bunch of qualifiers on it that put you at a disadvantage, it becomes, you know, a challenge. So just was trying to get a sense of what you thought about a federal law that said, you know, guaranteed your scholarship for a length of time post your 4-year education as a way to make sure that if you were injured, you get to complete, you know, your scholarship.
Yeah, that definitely sounds good. Just having the security to know that regardless of what happens physically about your ability to compete, that you are allowed to complete your degree that you were promised that you would be able to when you signed.
And then one of the other things we've been looking at is transferability, is just being able to make sure that you do have that ability to transfer. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think transferability is definitely an issue that regards athlete freedom and their ability. I think the limitations on transfers make it very difficult or pigeonhole athletes into one institution, regardless of if they are being mistreated or abused in any way. So I just think transferability is something that's definitely important in regards to athlete freedoms. And there's so many restrictions currently that restrict athletes from being able to transfer to certain schools, whether in the Pac-12, you maybe go to another competitive school or you'll have to sit out for a year. I don't think policies like that should have to be in place. And especially if coaches are able to, whether it's reduce contracts or do these other things, I think there should be more transfer freedoms for athletes as well.
Yeah, I know for basketball, if you transfer, you have to sit out a year. And then in certain conferences, the policy is dependent. If you transfer in conference, then you sit out a year and then you don't get that year back. So I think that restrictions on transferring can be problematic because, as we've all mentioned, there are a level of abuses that do occur within, you know, athletic departments that may lead an athlete to want to transfer. I also think another issue that I've seen play out is the way coaches can kind of control where you go just by word of mouth. Saying certain things about an athlete, intentionally bad-mouthing an athlete, or if they request a waiver to get their year back for whatever reason, maliciously like not signing the waiver or not, you know, providing any sort of statement or assistance in that process. So I think the coaches are given a significant amount of control over their athletes in the transfer process.
And was there something waived here during COVID that made a difference?
Yeah, the NCAA did put on a broad waiver for the year. So even if you played this year, like for basketball, you still get that year back and are able to continue playing.
And how, what do you think the effect of that was? Did we learn something from that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think the freedom that it offered to athletes was a big deal, and the fact that a lot of athletes were able to be like, okay, like I can leave, I can make this change. Like a lot of people are in the portal. It did make things a lot more hectic as far as recruiting was concerned. But I still think that the freedom that it offered was important.
Ms. Brown, anything on transferability?
Just in relation to the COVID year, I think that was really helpful, allowing students to opt out. There may have been like internal pressures at certain schools not to, but the waiver and the opt-out rule really allowed students to sort of put their physical health first this year, which I thought was really important. So if there was some sort of way to, like we were talking about injuries earlier and sort of being pushed to or encouraged to push through them, I think the opt-out this year was sort of really easy. You could just sort of say, I don't feel comfortable playing. And that should be an option for student athletes regardless of whether or not we're in a global pandemic.
And what is that today? What do you think that is today? You can opt out, right? I mean, you can be recruited and go to an institution and then decide not to participate, right?
Yes, that's true. If you decide not to participate, if you're on scholarship, though, then your scholarship, gets just revoked immediately.
And you think that's across the board?
I know that was at my institution, but I believe that's across the board.
Yeah, I think the way that works at Georgetown, once you're given the scholarship for the year and then you end up attending the university, then your scholarship is maintained throughout that year. But obviously it's renewed on a year-to-year basis. So if you're a first year, you decide not to play, then you only have 1 year of education paid for it. You have to figure out how to pay for the rest of the 4 years. And as far as opting out is concerned now, it's just different with COVID. So I was able to opt out. I'm a walk-on, so my scholarship isn't covered, but I did have teammates that opted out as well, and their scholarship was still taken care of for this year.
Okay. Yes, Ms. Brown.
Just to clarify, I wasn't necessarily talking about being able to sort of quit your sport and keep your scholarship, just in terms of like the safety aspect. With COVID, they sort of recognize that there is a real safety risk to playing right now, and you are allowed to opt out. But I think generally, even if it's for a period of time, like having the ability to say, I don't feel safe in this environment, or I'm in pain, I need help, and not feeling like there's going to be retribution, I think is important.
Yeah, that's part of the testimony we're submitting from Dallas Hobbs, who played at WSU, who led some concerns as it related to COVID standards during the football season and bringing that up. And so, yeah, we definitely, I think we want to get a little more information from the institutions across the United States on these things, but we think that is one of the benefits of setting a federal law, is to basically to clarify these things, to make sure that people understand them. We do know that there's a lot of money in sports, and particularly as these bowls and tournaments have continued to expand and are going to continue to expand more. And so we clearly want these issues dealt with, and we want clarity there for students. And So appreciate everybody being here today. I think I have testimony from one other person, Kayleigh Barton, who is a soccer player at WSU. And so we're going to also submit her testimony for the record. So, Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much for holding this hearing. I think it's absolutely critical that we address this issue. I also want to thank the panelists for being here. It is a very brave thing you're doing to stand up and let your voices be heard. I think most of America saw the viral videos from the NCAA basketball tournament where the women's team were treated so incredibly differently than the men's team. Everything from the type of COVID testing they were given, all the way through to that sad little so-called workout gym that they had, which was basically one stack of weights. I would love to hear from each of the panelists whether you think that the NCAA will ensure parity for male and female athletes, or do you think that Congress needs to step in here? And if you could give us any examples of disparate treatment between you and your male counterparts, the male teammates, teams, or whether you have seen some positive things that the NCAA has done. We would love to hear those as well. But do you think the NCAA is doing enough? Do you think that they will actually ensure parity? And do you think Congress should step in, and any examples you might have? And if I could hear from each of the panelists, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman. I think one of the first things that I can allude to, I don't think the NCAA ensures parity across genders at all. In a sport coming from track and field, there is a little bit more so, as there's our facilities exactly the same in that we do compete and train together. So I think in a sport like that, maybe. One thing that I did mention, though, a little bit earlier that I think definitely illustrates this difference of treatment between female and male athletes is the different facilities that excludes football. So I think the football facility has its own ability to have, they have 3 meals, unlimited meals basically actually throughout the day that are just catered to them. But then for all the other athletes, we only get like snacks or like bananas or things like that. So I think that's one extreme example where the NCAA doesn't hold parity accountable in regards to the treatment of football and other athletes, since there is no direct counterpart they put football on the same level as. So that's just one example in my experience.
Do you think Congress needs to step in?
I think it would be helpful in just regards to the treatment and resources that female athletes and other athletes outside of the revenue producing sports. I definitely think that would help if Congress stepped in regards to the treatment for the female athletes.
Thank you. From the other panelists?
Yes, I completely agree. I think Congress stepping in would be extremely beneficial. I do not believe the NCAA does enough. I think that's evident in the way that female athletes responded to Sedona Prince's posts. A lot of us weren't surprised. We've seen it before. It's happened on our own campuses. I know with Ms. Chenault, what you're talking about is common. I've seen it at other universities where football or basketball has their own separate facility that is completely divorced from the rest of athletics. In my experience, the men's basketball team has their own floor in our athletic department. So that's like one thing. A lot of times it's chalked up to, oh, well, they bring in more money. And that's kind of what you're told is the reasoning behind the treatment. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Like Ms. Chenault said, track and field is sort of, we all run on the same track. And so there's not a ton of gender disparity sort of in that sense. But I do think like we saw it with women's basketball and women's softball. And so I think it would be helpful for Congress to step in and sort of hold the NCAA accountable to Title IX and that sort of gender parity, because they don't have the capacity, I think, to treat sports equally. I think it's a choice. I think it's a choice they shouldn't be allowed to make.
Just one more thing, if I could add really quickly. Even in the conversation about like sports bringing in more revenue, I think it's important to cite the softball example, because in baseball and softball for both of their College World Series tournaments, the viewership is roughly the same. So this continued excuse that it's about revenue and viewers is just not accurate. We're continually being treated as an afterthought, even when we are bringing in money.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments, ladies. I can't see how much time I have left, but I suspect I don't, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Duckworth. And just to that last point, Ms. Cureton, this is the point I was trying to make earlier, that if you actually put the viewership out there and the internet gives you this huge opportunity to do that, you can see that you can build the audiences. And that's what's so, but you have to put the effort in and then, make sure that you're giving that focus and not just focusing on, one tournament or just on the male side of the equation. So I want to thank all the witnesses. This has been a tremendous hearing, and your input has just been so valuable. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks until July 1st, 2021. And so any senators who want to submit questions for the record should do so by that date. We ask that you respond as promptly as possible, in no case later than 2 weeks after the receipt of that information. So with that, we're adjourned.
Grass don't grow without the water. It's all right.
Very true. Very true. All right. So just to see where we left off. So I was talking about 1 year, 3 year, and 100-year projects, right? So we know that almost any meaningful social change is a 100-year project, right? It's something that transforms us those around us, and the things that serve us, and the people we serve, right? So I wanted to think about some things that are true and some things that make sense and some things that kind of only kind of make sense, right? So when we're thinking about power, we have to understand where power derives, right? Power is a relational statement, right? It's a relationship. It's something that relates. You have power in relation to someone else, right? In relation to some other thing. So when we're thinking about that, I look at some of the situations we find ourselves in Black community and in Black organizing spaces. And one of those is someone asked me, Montu, they said, I don't understand why my youth program is not working, right? So we do a lot of youth work. We do a lot of youth organizing. So why won't our youth program work? We have a lot of youth that are engaged, a lot of young people that are involved in it. Why isn't that transforming the community itself, right? And I assert that the reason why our youth programming models aren't working currently, right? And it's based on models that we've been following since the 80s, which is you work with the kid, you invest in the kid, transform the kid, they'll transform community, is because community is not the primary organizing unit in Black community. The primary organizing unit in Black community is Black family, right? Black family is the primary organizing unit. So any development, any improvement, any social services, social service programs aimed at particular members of the community, I assert are bound to fail. But when we start focusing on family development, move from a youth development space to a family development space, we'll see community transform. And I thought about this after watching and being involved in so many community organizations doing community work. And that's when I realized that it wasn't that we were doing bad work or weren't trying hard or weren't giving our best effort. It's because the community isn't the primary organizing unit. It's the family, right? We have to start with the family, right? And so investing in the child and not investing in the mother is a fool's errand, right? Investing in the son and not restoring the father is something a crazy person would do, right? So investing in Black family. And then I also run into people who seem to have a really strange relationship with government. So I ask people, what is the purpose of government? What do you think the purpose is? If anybody wanted to scream out what they think the purpose is, let me tell you, I think it's 3 answers I've heard over the years. One is help, one is hurt, one is get out of my way. They think the government is here to get out of your way, or they think it's here to hurt you, or they think it's here to help. Those are generally the answers I hear, right? Like if you ask me, I think the purpose of government is to help me. If government isn't here to help me, I have no use for government, right? So government is here to help me. Government does everything. I see a lot of people, complain about government checks, but no one complains when those contracts come through to build schools and build infrastructure in the neighborhood. Those are also government checks. They just don't go to your Black hands, right? But those are also government checks. So what is government here to do? Is government here to help you, hurt you, or get out of your way? Montu, what do you say?
Help. Like they have to. Like you have to be able to. So these structures are like where I'm going to be working. I'm going to be working at the school. Wouldn't have that without the government. So I believe the government's here to help. What do y'all think?
And your whole life is government. Your whole life is politics. The roads, there is
everything.
The biggest lie here oftentimes is you could do it yourself. You can't because no one else has. And you shouldn't have to, right? We are here to collaborate. We are here to communicate. We are here to work together with one another. It's just you've been blocked out so long, you might not realize that just yet. But all these structures are here to help us. If the school isn't teaching, we don't pull our kids out. We go into the schools and make the schools do right.
That's right.
If the public transportation isn't adequate to where I can live a life and work a job and go out on a date if I want to on public transportation, that's a public transportation problem. That's not a Travis problem, right? That's a public transportation problem, which is a government problem, right? And so, and then I get a lot of people who ask me about business and politics, and I think sometimes they're trying to black business they way out of blackness, and unfortunately that's an impossibility, right? The social structures are in place to access the opportunities to loans, the access to the education needed, to the information to be able to even apply for these loans, right? There is no business without politics, right? There is no access to business without politics, right? We have to remember that that if the family is the primary organizing unit, then the family is the primary political actors, right? We act on behalf of one another, on behalf of our neighbors, on behalf of our friends.
Righteous.
And through that, people will get the business contracts, right? So I was in a meeting with some people making decisions on who gets millions of dollars in government contracts in Athens. A bunch of money comes through between UGA and the local government. And they were, when you look at the money that comes through, nearly none of those dollars go to black businesses, right? When confronted, several of these very important elected people argued that there was no black businesses that were ready, that met the requirements to get the government contract, right? And I think that they thought that that was a good argument. See, it's y'all doing wrong. If you just get your business together, we'll give you the money. We ain't giving you the money because you ain't doing your job. My demand then became, well, you need to invest in the programs and invest in these businesses to get them up to the level to be able to apply for the contract. See, that's an opportunity for a government program, for government intervention, right? That's an opportunity for government to invest in black community. There's a good way to look at it is every house that you see get built, that's not just some big check being cut to build a house. That's 5 to 7 subcontractors, right? That's 5 to 7 subcontractors. You know what every house build has to have? It has to have a porta potty, sometimes 2, and it has to have a dumpster, right? That's an easy thing. Government can give me the grant right now, and I can go buy those porta potties and take them to and fro these places and get that government contract, right? So government created the problem. Government has to solve the problem. We have to make government solve it, but government has to solve the problem. So again, what is the purpose of government, right? So if the purpose of government is to help you, then the government is not government assistance, government programs, government funding, grants, and the like are not handouts. These things are a debt that is owed, right? These things are a social debt. These things are a particular debt related to your identity claim, right? To your lineal claim. And it's also just a societal debt, right? If government is here to help me, government should help me be a functional entrepreneur. Government should help me to be a functional father, a functional mother, to have the resources and material goods I need to live in a space beyond mere material deprivation, right? So when we think about power, we thinking about, hold on, stay back on that page. When we think about power, we think about, now we're really going to talk about it because we've kind of set up a framework or a way to look at things. Government is here to help. We have to make government help, but government has to give us the means to do so, right? So when you think about the library, like what's the point of the library, right? The library is in there just so we can check out books and do nice things. That's great. And the books that I'm referencing, I put on that table, they stacked them up. That's good. Those are some good books. We'll talk about them. But it's because you need an informed demos. You need an informed citizenry, right? The library is here so I can know what I'm voting for, so I can go read about social structures, so that I can go read about economics. So when they try to pass a SPLOST tax, I can do the research to know what it is and inform my wife and inform my children, and we can vote together as a family unit, right? This attempt to splinter the black family unit as individual voting pockets, like we don't vote with our wives, like we don't vote with our husbands, like we don't vote with our friends and neighbors and cousins, is kind of crazy in and of itself, right? But when we think about the black family as the primary organizing unit, we can bust up against that. It just is a matter of conception, right? So the basic question is, how does power manifest itself socially? So we're gonna run through that. So when we think about power is something that there are a lot of misconceptions about. So we're going to be talking about structural, institutional, systemic power, right? So we're talking about two basic meanings when you hear power, right? And as I say it, and you think about it, you'll realize that your idea of power fits into one of these two, or it may be an amalgamation of the two, right? So that when you have power, you're either talking about someone has the power to, so the power to do something, right? Or power over someone or something, right? So the power to do something, right? Or the power over someone or something, right? So power is the result of a series of ongoing interactions of people in the world, right? So power is never static, it's dynamic. Circumstances change, as I always say, right? And sometimes you'll see, sometimes our politicians pretend like circumstances didn't change, right? Like black people didn't turn Georgia blue. They pretend and they forget sometimes. And sometimes events like this have to remind them that black people turned this state blue, right? That there is a political obligation that is created with that, right? To hear our claims, to talk to us seriously and sincerely about our claims. So 3 basic types of power, right? We're talking about force, coercion, and influence, right? Force is very direct. It's almost inherently what we think about when we think about power. Coercion is a step back from force, right? It's the threat of force to get an outcome, right? So my ability, power as a relational statement that describes my ability to impose my will or to create outcomes for myself, even with you in the way, right? So force, punch, coercion, threat to punch, and influence. You know, I punched Bob the other day. You don't want to mess with me, right? Because that's not a direct coercion. That's more of an influence. I know that he's a tough guy and he punches people, right? So when we think about power, it's a couple thinkers that have been really influential to me. One of those is Karl Marx, right? I fundamentally disagree with a lot of things Marx wrote and some of the thinkers who've written after Marx, but power does not belong to you. Power is not an individual asset you hold, right? We said it's a relational statement. It's not like a brush or a pencil or a sheet of paper, right? It's not something you individually hold and you can individually lose, right? You can gain or relinquish some power in relation to where you stand socially with someone else. And it's not an understanding, right? Oftentimes you'll hear people say that they feel empowered, right? Not that they have been, not that any decisions by institutions or government has been democratized, but that they feel empowered because someone listened to them, right? Which is nice. It's good to feel good, right? But we're talking about democratization of the major decisions and level pulls in government and in society. So when we're thinking about power, we're talking about, when we think about force, we can think about force in really force and power in three more different ways, but kind of like offshoots, right? So we're thinking of brute force or brute power, right? So that's lifting a box, me physically, mechanically moving or changing the circumstance of something, right? Cooperative power, me and Montu collaborate together to move an even larger box, right? And then structural power, Bob is the mayor. He can tell me to move the box, right? He can get us to move the box, right? For his benefit, for social benefit, and otherwise. So again, power is a statement of relational leverage, the ability of persons and groups to impose will. Right? So who, what, where, when, how, and why do issues come to require an outcome, right? Because if something gets into the political space, it's something that now needs a decision made. How do things get to a point of a decision needing to be made? That's a question for the group. How do things get to a point of a decision needing to be made? Let's say there's a pothole in my neighborhood, right? There's a pothole right outside of my house. That's a problem for me. The road is a public road. It's owned by the government. How does that issue get to get to the point of a structural decision by government actors. Contact my rep. That's what I love so much really about watching local government is because someone is always yelling about a pothole. And it's really inspiring because they really take this pothole really serious and fight for it, right? Because that's a real problem they facing every day, right? Just like I'm facing the threat of state coercion and state violence through the hands of police and institutional actors. They're facing the same thing in that pothole in a very sometimes comical way, but it's something that they face every day, and to see them do it, it really is inspiring. So how does an issue like, let's say you find out that your neighborhood has bad water, right? When we think about Flint, right? We think about Flint, we think about, or even closer to home, when we think about some of the really Georgia has so many counties with serious environmental problems that are primarily racial. Landfills, a great example, right? So how do issues like that become known? If you don't know about it, right, someone has to educate and inform you, get you aware of the thing that is, right? Because when we think about Flint, right, we know that there was lead in the water. Well, what significance does that have, right? Does it make the water taste bad? No, I don't know. I can't really taste it. Obama was so crazy that time he drank the water on that news conference, I remember. If I remember correctly, that was crazy. So you think it might not have been that water, it might have been a different water. And so when we think about lead in the water, lead is a neurotoxin, right? What do neurotoxins do? Neurotoxins lower your IQ. They impact and impede your ability to exercise inhibitions. They disrupt your neurobiological growth, right? So Bobby, who's 5 years old, has been drinking neurotoxin water his entire life, and when Bobby turns 19, he might slap his girlfriend, right? Is that a social problem? Is that a Bobby problem? Is that our problem? Is that a community problem? The way we conceive that problem is directly related to how we educate ourselves and how we educate within the community, right? So when we think about our social conditions, right, we think about the world around us. We live in a state, so what's the significance of the state? I remember we were doing a car caravan about defund the police, something that is, I think this group really kind of took it to a different place, but that's not really the point. And so we were doing this caravan. They asked me to come and do a radio show where the protesters would listen, and they were having all kind of issues, right? And to be able to educate them via the radio and break it down to where no one was arrested that day. The police got a little rowdy, the people got a little rowdy, but no one was arrested, no one was hurt. Was a great instance of what political education can do, right? But it started with getting them to understand, like, when they were talking about a monopoly of violence held by the state or something of the sort, right? And that's not really an accurate conception of it, right? The state has a monopoly of force, not necessarily violence. Hannah Arendt, one of my favorite political theorists, says where there is violence, there is no power, right? That power is if you have power, you won't utilize violence, right? So that's one way to think of it. But the state can authorize and enable some actors and some people to use force and disable other actors to not use force, right? So the state also manages identity and justice claims. The state enables and disables actions. We talked about that. And the state authorizes commons. A couple months ago, we started doing these vaccine drives, right? We started doing a bunch of vaccine drives in the community. And it was problematic enough that people weren't getting vaccinated, but what was really troubling was it was being described as hesitancy. See, it's you black people, it's you poor white people, it's you little Mexican boy. Y'all don't want to get the vaccine. We want to give it to you. You don't want to get it. And that's crazy, right? It wasn't a matter of hesitancy to the extent I'm hesitant is because of the institutional distrust, and distrust, again, is a relationship. It's a relationship, right? You can make our relationship bad, right? It's not something that I necessarily can do independently, right? So we started doing these vaccines, and we were collaborating with some elected people, and I pulled Montu in. I said, look, I got to get you here, brother, because I need somebody to cuss at when the meeting over with. And so we go to these meetings, and they wanted to do it far out. We decided we needed to do it in the government housing where our people was, where we organized so much, right? And one of the limiting factors in where we've been able to even have some of these vaccine drives, and we've been fortunate enough to get a large swath of the black community in Athens vaccinated, and we still got so many gaps and still got so many places to go, is the Department of Public Health wasn't ready to make the kind of commitment that we needed them to make in order to transform our health and social situation under the COVID conditions, right? And so after getting no emails and no callbacks, I thought of something, and Montu remembers this. He remembers the whole thing, not just this part I'm talking about. But in 2006, my sister passed away from AIDS. She lost her battle with AIDS in 2006. And so I started getting involved and engaging with people in the HIV/AIDS community. And I realized that the one resource that the DPH will sometime invest in black community is HIV/AIDS testing and screening, right? So what does that tell me? That tells me that those people that are doing that screening at least aren't afraid of black people in the most obvious way, because they have to deal with them, because it's the only resource they send into our community, right? So we started organizing with those people. And we got those people to put pressure on the people that control them and their supervisors. And next thing you know, we got vaccination drives popping up in government housing. We go into the barbershops and they giving out vaccinations, right? Because this group, as imperfect as that resource allotment was, it gave us at least a starting point to work with some people who would be sensitive to the issues that our community was facing as it relates to distrust towards the vaccine, right? They managed this whole thing crazy and let propaganda run wild on Facebook and TikTok. I did not know people was getting news on TikTok till we started going door to door. I didn't even know you could get news on there. Go ahead. And so one of the limiting factors, like I said, was the fact that it's very few common spaces, right? And the state authorizes commons, right? So areas for people to meet and do activities, have get-togethers, have all kind of stuff, but most importantly, to organize for political action, right? If you see a lack of organizing, you probably have a lack of commons in your community. So a lack of places where people can go and don't have to pay no money and can sit down with other people who don't have money, who want to organize and do work and change the community, right? It takes time to establish those kinds of things. So we're usually sitting in a political space that was advocated for, fought for, and constructed over 10 years ago, right? So we have to think about as community grows, as new community needs pop up, we have to confront those. At one of the local community centers, they've brought in some kind of technology kind of floor, right? But they haven't staffed anybody with it, right? So there's no one there with the expertise to teach our kids how to use this technology, and that was the whole point of it. So we, even when we get something, the fight has to continue to perfect that outlay, right? To perfect that institutional outlay. All right, so you heard me reference political action. So when we think about political action, we have to think about harm, and harm can be personal or it can be communal harm, right? And that can be a deficit, a material or social deficit. It can be inequality, so inequality in outcome, access. In inequality usually serves as the basis for our organizing efforts because harm is sometimes hard to articulate, right? Particularly social harm, so anything that's not directly material that we can't count from and put on a scale and weigh and look at a number to identify with. So, but harm has to be recognized by those harmed to exist and recognized by the structural forces to legitimate it, right? So I recently did a symposium about slavery at UGA, right? And they had all these words in the title, and one of the words they used was recognition, right? And what I realized is that they really didn't want to recognize what was done. So one of the stories I told was of this brother named John Lee Eberhard. He was lynched 100 years ago in Athens, right? So 100 years ago he was arrested, wrongfully arrested, and he was in the courthouse, being held in the jail cell in the courthouse. And the Klan and random white supremacists, they ran in the courthouse and they dragged him out of the courthouse, tied him to a tree, and burned him alive, right? So when we talk about recognition, right, when we talk about recognizing that harm, it's not sufficient enough to even put up a placard. It's not sufficient enough to even write a little resolution, which they did to the local government's credit when it was brought up and everything. But to truly recognize it in kind, right? So he was pulled out of the courthouse, so I want a placard and a statue on the steps of the courthouse, right? I want the harm that was caused to him and his family recognized, because recognition gets us closer to redress, right? There's a debt owed to that man's family and his lineage that should be paid, right? And that gets us just a step closer. So advocates use political means to cause institutions and institutional actors to recognize harm, right? So this is sit-ins, this is marches, this is educational and political events, rallies. These are these sorts of things, right? But redress presupposes recognition. Redress is a material political outcome. However, symbolism is often used by the state to dodge redress, right? So when we talk about symbolism, well, let me take a step back. So what is recognition, right? Recognition it really creates a obligation to the observer, right? So the person, not the person recognized, but to the person doing the recognizing. And it creates an obligation to cultivate and defend through solidarity, express universal respect, right? So when we're talking about respect, we're talking about autonomy and dignity, right? Respecting the autonomy and dignity of the person you are recognizing, right? Institutions do this as opposed to stigmatizing groups, right? When we think about stigma, we're talking about discredited institutional and structural relationships, right? So the police don't believe you because you're a brother. The police don't believe you because you got dreads. Your job won't promote you because it don't like your natural hair, right? Like these are relationships that you're experiencing stigmatization, right? Spoiled identity, as it's been called. So that's why at times recognition can be very elusive, right? But one thing I noticed also, particularly lately, is I don't think a lot of people have thought about what justice is or what justice means or how they would even define justice, right? And sometimes people look at justice as just an institutional artifact, right? So something that an institution creates or produces, right? So let's using Breonna Taylor, for example, right? Because those officers weren't held to account, that therefore justice is impossible, or she won't get justice, or there is no justice for Breonna Taylor, right? I would submit that justice is a virtue, right? It's something that we're striving for. It's an imperfect striving. Maybe we never reach it. Maybe we never get there. But the work is that continued effort. So I say that to say, what would be justice for me from a Breonna Taylor standpoint? What murdered that young lady was some crazy, racist, wild cops, right? But how did they get into that house? Through a no-knock warrant, right? What would be justice for Breonna Taylor? A federal ban on no-knock warrants, right? State-by-state ban on no-knock warrants. There will never be another Breonna Taylor or anyone caught in that situation again, right? We can't change the hearts and minds of people, right? That might not prevent that particular instance, but what we can do is disenable status actors, political actors, elected people, and police officers to behave in the ways that produced that woman's death, right? That killed her, right? That murdered her. So we only got a few more minutes left, so I'm gonna try to run through. So so when we're thinking about power and we're thinking about institutions, I just want to leave with a couple quick points. So someone would ask me, what is an institution? When you're thinking about what is an institution as opposed to an organization, right? As opposed to the state itself, right? The state is oftentimes can be thought of as being made up of a bunch of institutions, but functionally, right? What is an institution? It's something that mediates. Institutions are the mediating agents between people in the state, right? So the hospital is an institution, right? Because it mediates the health needs of the people with the state's obligation to keep the people safe, right? So that is what institutions mediate between people and what they need. So institutions also process individuals, validate and invalidate claims, and yeah, so we'll go ahead. All right, so we only got a few minutes left. You wanted to throw anything out there? If y'all have any questions, ideas, thoughts, anything you want to get off your chest, say. This would be a very appropriate time for questions, ideas, or anything of the sorts. All right. Yes, sir. We will get that email. We actually had a whole thing, but we couldn't get Wi-Fi, so we'll send that out to be got to people. Yes, sir.
Boots on the ground.
All right. So
Anything else? Anybody have any questions, concerns, comments?
Anybody want to share some interesting work they're doing back home, their neighborhood, their community, their block, and their family? Yes, ma'am. Or if you feel like you can vocalize that for our shoot.
Yeah, come on, come on.
Trying to be loud.
Thank you all so much for this event. My name is Efat Walker. I'm running for Rockdale County Post 2 Commission. Listen, today is a dynamic day. It's an opportunity to get people registered to vote. We have so many people that are out there doing the work. Please, please, please take what the information that you have from here today, take it back to your communities, get people registered, register at least 5 other people. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Absolutely.
And we just have to remember, like, the network is where the power is at. Power is in the people. So, these events are always great. We can come together, hand out some literature and all that, but we have to put our boots on the ground and actually get some work done. So we have to network. We have to move. We have to do some action. We got to make some things happen. So let's take these events and really grow something from them.
And when we look at a world post SB 202, right? When we look at a world in this voter suppression point of view, right? Worldview. The big problem we have to remember is not SB 02 and what is authorized and what is disabled from SB 202. The real problem is that the idea that undergirds that policy is some nonsense, crazy claim that somehow the election was stolen from a wild orange-haired man. That is the crazy aspect of SB 202, right? Is that it justifies and legitimates via our governor and via our General Assembly that somehow the election was stolen or the election results were illegitimate, and not actually making a claim that they were illegitimate, not actually litigating the legitimacy of those claims, because that's already been decided, but to create a political ethos that would authorize future disabling acts, right? It's one thing to say, okay, when you do your absentee ballot, you have to have an ID. What is the next step? Because that next step is what we need to be organizing against, because that next step is going to be the one that really gets rid of a crop of voters. That next step is the one that's really going to authorize the state to come in and take over election boards sua sponte, without any sort of claim, just directed by the Secretary of State. And we saw what happened the last time the Secretary of State had his hands on the election in a way, okay? So let's keep that in mind and let's remember that. But so yeah, I think that is important, right? So when we're thinking about how important it is to vote, is critical. But you know what's also equally important? To be an active member of the demos, period, right? You vote and then you go to the meeting. You can't go to the meeting, find somebody in your building, find somebody in your neighborhood that can go, that can be there a few minutes, right? That can come back and share that information with you, right? It's been a bunch of shootings in our neighborhood crazily lately in Athens, and one of the neighborhoods where it was kind of the wildest sort of expression of it was the same neighborhood who I helped the older lady get her toilet fixed because the landlord refused to fix the toilet. Well, a landlord that won't fix the toilet is definitely not putting you in social conditions that would be safe and thoughtful and encourage growth of the individual people and individuals in that community, right? But now we're taking steps to try to organize towards a neighborhood association, so a restorative framing of a neighborhood watch, right? And looking at each one of these deficits that pop up in our community and trying to address them collaboratively as a community, and with the understanding that the Black family is the primary organizing unit, right? So going door to door, just trying to get folks to understand, hey, you want some washing machines because that will make your social life easier. Boom, well, you need to come to this meeting so we can also talk about getting this custodial worker some better wages so he'll work a little bit harder, and making sure that they clean up and get this dumpster right? So taking those little steps. So I don't know. They said 5 minutes ago, like 10 minutes ago. I got a bunch I can still. All right. So any other questions? All right. Go for it. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, folks. My name is Michael. I'm with Georgia Stand Up in the Orange. How you doing, brother? Listen, we're registering people to vote. There's a lot of different organizations that are registering people to vote. However, what I want to share with you, if you did not vote last election, if your address or name has changed in the last year, if you're not sure, if you're still registered to vote, please come back and see us under the orange tents back there with the orange shirts, so we can make sure that your information is accurate, and so when you go to one of the polls, you will not be turned around like it has happened before, okay? Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful time.
Yes. Before I go, I do want to say one thing. We have to take these spaces back. So we need to start filling up these Board of Education meetings. We need to start filling up these commission meetings. We got to take these spaces back, because if you're not going to these spaces and getting active, then, you know, these kind of events is going to be meaningless. So we really got to take what we, you know, that fire that we get here, and we got to take them back to our communities and start filling up these spaces, because if we don't fill up these spaces, someone else will, and they're not going to be necessarily for us.
So you want to take us out with a little call and response?
Let me do a little call and response. So in Athens, I'm called the ambassador of Classic City Hip Hop, because I do a lot of hip hop, and we do a lot of political action with the hip hop community. So some of y'all was here, some of y'all wasn't. So there's a lot more people here, so I feel like we should be a little louder now, all right? So if you wasn't here, when I say black voters, you say matter. Black voters!
Matter!
That was like 5 people, man. Come on. We can do better than that. Black voters!
Matter!
Black voters!
Matter!
Black voters!
Matter!
Let's get active.
And I just want to lead, I'm going to lead this for y'all. The future political leaders do something with this. I think we need to make, just like they just made Juneteenth a national holiday, Election Day needs to be a national holiday. Everybody needs that day off work, paid holiday. We need to have celebrations, parties. See, I'm from South Florida, and we party. But I'm going to tell you what. I'm talking about parades. I'm talking about floats. I'm talking about real get-togethers, right? And really get people excited about democracy. You want to change the world. You want to change your community. Get people excited about political activity, about political action. It don't gotta be your life, but your life is contingent on it. Understand? You want a job that makes sense, you gotta do politics that makes sense, right? You want a home that makes sense, you gotta do politics that makes sense. You want your child to be loved, you gotta do politics like you love your child, right? Thank y'all. porta